Are we on? Are we on?
Hello, hello. I don't see us.
Hello? Hello? We're on. We are live, apparently, according to this thing that's going on here on my YouTube Google Hangouts thing.
I see your pretty face on my YouTube. I think it works.
There we go. We are live. Heyo, what's going on, everybody?
Hello.
Uh, as you guys know, this is our first ever live cast episode for Game of Thrones Arya 5, or not Arya 5, Arya 4.
It's already going wrong.
Yeah, it's already we're already fucking up right here. So yeah, it's already starting out so well. So hello and welcome to the NotACast podcast, the one true chapter by chapter podcast going through a Song of Ice and Fire one chapter a week. I am one of your hosts, Jeff, better known as Brendan Beefish.
And I'm your other host, Emmett, better known as Poor Quentin.
And welcome to our 50th. Motherfucker, we have 50 episodes of the NotACast entitled Because That's What Heroes Do. An analysis of a Game of Thrones Arya 4 in which poor Arya Stark has to run for her life, but not before seeing her mentor Syrio Forel go down like the badass that he is. And man, is he ever the badass in this chapter.
Even more so than usual. Yeah, I've been hyping up this chapter for quite some time. It's a favorite of mine, so I'm glad you all can be here to witness me blubber over it.
Oh my gosh, it's going to be such a fantastic chapter. Like, I've been looking for this chapter for months now. Like, I remember last week we were talking about how Eddard 14 was the chapter that I was really excited about getting to, but Arya 4 is a very close second in terms of chapters. When we started this podcast, that I was very, very excited to get into because this chapter is phenomenal, as we're going to talk about here. So
Eddard 14 is the big one in terms of plot, but Arya 4 in character terms, I think, is the big climax. Yeah.
Oh man, it's going to be so great narrating all of Syrio Forel's lines in this chapter. I can't wait. So
every single one.
Every goddamn line of his. So as always, this episode is brought to you by our small council, our Hand of the King, Wolfman Zach, who is apparently in the chat. Grand Maester Timothy W., Lord Commander of the King's Guard, Mark N., Lord Travis, Master of Ships and Word of the Waves, also in the chat. Sir Keith J., Master of Whispers, who I think is in the chat too. Lord Philip the Merciful, Master of Laws. Jancy O., Lady Commander of the Night's Watch. Archmaester June, Healer of the Lesser Poxes. Ragged Michael. By the way, I love that name, Ragged Michael. So if you ever become a part of our small council, come up with a fucking badass name like Ragged Michael. Ragged Michael, Warden of the North. Nelson the Hammer, Prince of Dragonstone. And Lord Jean, Master of Coin. Thank you, counselors, very much.
Thank you, as always, counselors. And I share my co-host's love of colorful adjectives. Come up with them, folks. Do some work.
Oh, yeah, you guys got to do work here. So, yeah. Again, very excited to be doing this episode. Our spoiler room is saying in all episodes, we'll be talking about all published books. That is the 5 novels, the 3 Duncan Egg novellas, histories, interviews, the Winds of Winter sample chapters, as well as Game of Thrones, the TV show. Anything and everything.
So our question this week, more of a comment, comes from Lady Yvonne, a sworn sword, who had a comment about some of our past coverage of Septim Ordain worth highlighting. Hi guys, I'm fairly new to your podcast and I enjoyed immensely. I'm only now listening to Arya 1 and I thought about what you said about Septim Ordain. I think you misunderstand the consequences that her position as Septa of 2 young ladies has and are therefore too harsh on her character. It is a Septa's job not only to oversee a lady's education, but also to oversee her behavior and to guarantee her virginity and faithfulness to her future husband. If she fails in this, she will be severely punished by the Faith, as we can see with Marjorie's scepter after she is taken into custody by the Faith. For Septim Ordain, Arya's behavior is probably a harbinger of bad deeds in the future. When Arya plays with the small folk children, she probably already sees an older Arya tumbling in the hay with a stable boy. Her position, her well-being, everything she is depends on how her charges behave, and this is perhaps why she is so hard on Arya. That's a great comment, Lady Yvonne. Thank you for bringing it up. And by the way, if you guys have particular questions going into this chapter, you can feel free to bring them up in the chat, and we'll try to snag them and answer them as we go. But Jeff, what do you think about that in terms of our take on Septim Ordain so far?
I regret nothing about our take about Septim Ordain. No, I'm kidding.
How did I see that coming?
No, it's a really good comment because I think it does speak to Septim Ordain's official role in the series in being the instructor of Sansa and Arya, as well as serving a bit of a mentorship role to a number of the other women and girls that are in the Winterfell entourage and courtier. But at the same time, she kind of is the worst of all time because Septim Ordain. How do I say this? I mean, okay, so last week when Ned Stark is talking with Septim Ordain, or talking rather with Sansa and Arya, and Septim Ordain is there, and Sansa says, "Hey, I would love to go see Joffrey one last time." And Mordain is like, "Oh, don't worry, Lord Eddard, I'll go take her to Joffrey one last time." And then Ned's like, no, you can't do that. And then Sansa starts like breaking down because she doesn't understand, which is, again, being so fair to Sansa, as I always am in this podcast, as I always am, is basically is good. I mean, it's good that Ned's saying she can't see Joffrey, but then Septim Dane doesn't really help the situation. Instead, she says, well, your father knows best, sort of thing, which I don't know if you guys remember being 11 years old, seeing that it's my birthday and I'm turning 11 today. I'm keenly aware of this, is that when people say that your father or your mother knows best as an 11-year-old, you just don't get it. You don't understand it. And it really doesn't help reinforce what Ned Stark is attempting to do here. Like, she needs to like kind of step up a little bit in order to help Ned out a bit, in order to show that what, Ned is doing here is not just correct because he's saying so, but there's probably a deeper purpose here. So instead of saying your father knows best, maybe say, yeah, it sucks that you can't see Joffrey. I'm so sorry about that, showing that sympathy and empathy and compassion. And at the same time, also being like, well, he has reasons and real reasons that he will definitely explain to you come later on when you guys are on the ship getting back towards Winterfell or something like that. So yeah, I get I get what Lady Yvonne's saying about Septim Ordain. I do think that Septim Ordain, though, doesn't do well by these girls. She really reinforces some of the gender stereotypes in Westeros. And when Arya can't really act up the way that she's supposed to, because that's not who she is as a character and as a person, it really has a major impact on Arya, and that she feels isolated and alienated from her sister and really from Winterfell as well. Like, there's no sense that, like, basically Septim Ordain is forcing the girls down one particular pathway. And if you are not on that pathway, then you're going to have some significant consequences and fallbacks from the ladies at court. And Septim Ordain reinforces that by being the authority figure for these girls and not being a good authority for these girls. But I've been talking a lot. So Emmett, what do you think? Why do you think that Septim Ordain is the worst of all time?
You make excellent points, as does Lady Yvonne, in terms of, we're not saying Septim Ordain's role shouldn't exist. We're not saying Ned and Catelyn should not have hired some kind of woman or religious authority to see to Sansa and Arya's education as young noblewomen. That's obviously a very important role, and Catelyn's probably not going to be able to play that role entirely by herself. That does make sense. But I don't think she's playing that role particularly successfully, and I don't entirely agree with a lot of the premise and the question. I don't see why Arya being a horse girl makes her more inclined to bed down with grooms or stable boys or other small folk lads later in life. I mean, we have no indication that Gatehouse Amy observed these tomboy tactics, but she's still known for sleeping with men who are, for many of her family, below her station. Marjorie's cousins, in all likelihood, at least one of them needs the moon tea she acquired from Maester Pycelle, and they're much more in the Sansa end of the direction. So I don't necessarily agree. I mean, I think if Septim Ordain feels that way, then I think she's incorrect, is what I'm saying. And I don't necessarily consider that a mark in her favor, but a stereotype she is observing. So while I don't think Mordain is a monster, and I don't think that her role doesn't need to exist, I think she's part of a pattern in these early books where the Stark sisters, A, don't receive much valuable instruction, and B, you can see kind of Martin's world building failing, and he doesn't really provide, this is something that people who know much more about it than me have talked about, he doesn't really provide a realistic woman's court around Sansa and Arya in the way there most likely would be in a family of that type. And I think you can see him trying to correct that later with the Tyrells in Sansa's early Storm of Swords chapters. So I think Mordain ends up kind of getting short shrift from the audience and the author in that regard. But I don't think we've been too terribly harsh on her, out of proportion anyway.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think we haven't been too harsh on her. I think when we were talking about some of the earlier chapters, like, George could have fleshed her character out a little bit more. Maybe she has some sort of backstory that could have been integrated into her to kind of show us why she's so rigid. Because as it stands right now, the plot purpose she serves is to be an impediment to Arya and to reinforce Sansa's notions of femininity in the story in kind of a wrong-headed way. Now, I think you could kind of develop some backstory. If you guys are interested in writing fan fiction, write some Septim Ordain fan fiction, because I don't think I've ever seen a single, Septim Ordain fan fiction story so far here. So I think it's, I don't know. I feel very I don't feel very sympathetic to her. I mean, it's really hard when Sansa sees Septim Ordain's head at the end of her arcs, at the end of her arc, a Game of Thrones arc, that is. And I think it's really kind of tough because, like, you're supposed to feel sympathy, and you do feel sympathy, but at the same time, it's not like this chapter where Syrio Forel, where he dies, where you're like actually legitimately kind of crushed by it, even though that Syrio Forel is in fewer chapters than Septim Ordain is. I mean, Septim Ordain is in at least 10 chapters in a Game of Thrones, but it's much more, it could be much better had she had a bit of more of a backstory. Maybe she was in like became a sister of Septa because she had a really strict mother figure, an actual mother, biological mother figure, and she had a really strict mother figure at the Septa house. You know, these are types of things that might have been done in order to kind of pick her character up and develop her into a little more three-dimensional as opposed to this kind of two-dimensional character. And I do think there's also a little bit of kind of like that early fantasy onset, or rather early fantasy mentality where George is kind of developing the world and he doesn't have time to kind of develop these kind of backstory and secondary characters in the same way that he does a much better job of doing that in A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons especially.
Great point. So some questions we're getting from the chat. There are two main questions in general, one of which is just terribly irresponsible and bad, and one of which is respectable and honorable. The irresponsible one is about whether Syrio is in fact alive and Jock and Hagar or one of those other characters, and I promise we'll get to that in the main episode and you will regret ever asking it or indeed being born. The other question, much more reasonable, is what Syrio Forel was doing before Ned hired him. Our Hand of the King Wolfman Zach brought this up and a couple people echoed him in the chat. And that's an interesting question. My sense is with Syrio, and I don't know if we ever learned any specifics about why he left Braavos. I don't think we did. But my sense with him is that as great as he is a little old. He is slightly past his prime. And so he's not necessarily going to be First Sword of Braavos well into his 40s and 50s. So he's had to take work in the same way that, like, you know, a great concert pianist in his youth might fall on hard times and have to teach local middle school kids how to play piano. Like, that's the position Syrio is in, I think, at this point. Certainly that mystery around Syrio's background opens it up to outlandish theories, as again we will get to later in the episode proper.
Yeah, I've actually seen some really interesting theorizing that maybe hasn't risen to the surface as much as some of the other Syrio Forel ugly, stupid theories held by morons, which is that Syrio Forel might have been the first sword for the Sea Lord that had died potentially around the time that Daenerys and Viserys had to flee from Braavos. I think that's a really interesting theory because there's the possibility and potential that Syrio might have known Daenerys and Viserys, or at least been exposed to them. If we're going to talk about another little theory here in a little bit about the Sea Lord's palace and the potential that the House of the Red Door is there, because we do get some interesting information from this chapter about Braavos there. I could see that being the case where the Sea Lord, you know, dies at the end of his long life or short life, depending on the Sea Lord's status, so to speak. But at the same time, when he dies, what ends up happening for him is that he's Syrio Forel also has to flee because he can't, you know, survive legitimately in Braavos there, and he comes to King's Landing because there is a need for swords potentially in King's Landing. I could see that being the case, although I do wonder about what that would actually mean for the story, because I think one of the big things, and we talked about this a little bit as well, in the main cast and our Patreon episodes, is that these kind of big theories, they have to not just mean something to the reader when you're reading the books, they actually have to mean something to the characters in the story, right? So Syrio potentially knowing Daenerys and Viserys when he was the first sword of Braavos, what would that actually mean to the characters in universe? And how would that information be conveyed to a character like Arya Stark when she's in Braavos, in Feast for Crows, Dance of Dragons, and The Winds of Winter? I know in the Mercy chapter, if I'm not mistaken, and I know Aziz is in the chat, so he can definitely be the one to correct me on this, but I believe there's a mention of a Forel that is mentioned in and around the play that Arya is participating in the Mercy chapter.
I'm pretty sure that's true, yeah.
And I do think that it's possible that Arya could run into this Forel and be like, "Hey, I knew your brother, cousin, father, whatever this type of person is," and he can say, "Well, that's interesting that you mentioned this because my father, cousin, brother Syrio was the first sword of Braavos and was there when Daenerys and Viserys were living in Braavos at the time." So I think there's possibilities that way. Again, you just have to kind of counter that with, like, it's great for us as it's great for us as readers. We're like, oh my gosh, this great reveal, but it also has to mean something for the characters in order to have real sustainability as a theory. That's just my opinion about it necessarily.
Absolutely. And I also think Braavos, much as I love the city, as a place of ex-slaves and immigrants and poor people coming together to build like this Venetian-style free republic. I love that as just a world-building concept.
Yeah.
You can definitely tell that Martin is making a lot of it up as he goes along, and they didn't have this huge conception of Bravos built in from the start of the series. And Bravosi characters and institutions kind of shape themselves as the narrative sees fit, and it's pretty obvious as such, which doesn't change the quality of the content of a lot of those scenes. I love Arya's time with Jaqen H'ghar and at the House of Black and White, but I don't think Bravos is heavily connected to theories that have, not theories, to ideas and mysteries that have been there from the start of the series. Because I think in this first book, Bravos and the Faceless Men are just taking form in Martin's head, and they're not a huge part of the world building yet.
Yeah, totally agreed. Do we have any other comments that we need to address or questions there? Now's the time to kind of throw your questions up there, because we're going to start getting in deep on this episode about Arya Stark and her 4th chapter in A Game of Thrones here. We'll give it a minute to see if anybody has anything for us.
Everyone seems to want to know about my new cats, and the answer is they'll come out. They'll come out when they're ready.
Aziz says, "Tell us about your cats." Emmett, tell us about your cats.
They're named Jaehaerys and Alysanne, and I love them very much. Alysanne's very sweet and cuddly and hangs out. Jaehaerys more skulks in the shadows and rules from afar. He's more like Aegon III, really. We should have named him better than that. But yeah, they're adorable, and it's a perfect question for a cat-themed chapter, though, because Syrio Forel, of course, has the great story that we'll get into that is all centered around a cat and the Sea Lord of Bravos. So,
yeah.
Oh, we just got a question in the chat. Will your cat show up before the Winds of Winter? That cuts deeply and is an unfair question in a variety of ways. I don't think I like you people very much.
But I thought I was the mean one, and you were the nice one.
Will they never understand that it's exactly the opposite? That you have a heart of gold and I hate everybody? Maybe they'll catch on now.
Maybe, yeah. I guess now you guys are actually seeing how this thing gets
our true selves.
Our true selves coming out to the fore. And then we got another question from Natalie asking, "Are we going to get an appearance from the Girls Gone Canon podcast?"
Well, as it happens, they're recording as we speak. They're recording their next Theon chapter over in just the next room. So much good work gets done just in this little apartment. So I think they'll come into the chat once they're done recording. They're doing Theon 4 and 5 in A Clash of Kings right now. So we will see when they are free. But I hope so.
Yeah, that'll be a lot of fun. And then we got another question from Scott at 15. He says, "Regarding what Emmett said about Bravos not being in George's head from the get-go, do you think that applies to the influence impact on the story that the Iron Bank would have as well?"
That's an excellent point. And yeah, I completely agree. The Iron Bank should be significantly more influential than even it is by the end of A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. I'm very curious to see what Martin does with it going forward, because it is one of the big modern world-shaping institutions you see in A Song of Ice and Fire, in terms of like when I think about what the world of Westeros and Essos would look like post-feudalism, post the medieval era. The Iron Bank looms large, and Bravos in general looms large as like what that world will look like. So I think if Martin had more of a conception of Bravos in mind, earlier in the books we would have seen the Iron Bank mentioned a lot more. Like Robert would have brought it up. Ned would have been specifically aghast at only the Iron Bank because they always come for their money. And I think Martin's trying to emphasize now, when we get to them backing Stannis and potentially backing Asha, that they're going to be a major player at the end of the series and maybe post-Endgame. We'll see.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I also like the idea, and we talked about this when we were talking about Eddard 8, about the Faceless Men, that maybe George didn't quite have the concepts of the Faceless Men established. And really, there's kind of that really weirdness in A Clash of Kings, where Jaqen H'ghar references the Red God, and the Red God.
Yeah, that's weird.
Which is just a weird kind of world-building thing, which George might retcon it some ways, but I also think like it's interesting that George is, as everybody here who's listening knows, is a person who writes from the perspective of a gardener, not an architect. So he kind of is developing the story as it comes along, and he's developing kind of just the way that he writes is such that he has an idea like, oh, there's the Faceless Men of Bravos. That sounds like a really cool concept. And then he greatly expands that out in the books after book after book, so that we have a real culture based around the Faceless Men, seemingly by A Feast for Crows, and then it gets even further expansions into Dance with Dragons and into the Winds of Winter, and of course the World of Ice and Fire too. I can see the same thing happening with the Iron Bank of Bravos, with that being kind of an institution, like kind of being this bank that they're like, okay, George is like, okay, this is great. This is interesting to have on hand in order to kind of show the dire financial situation that Ned Stark is in. But at the same time, also being like, Well, this is actually going to have a major impact come A Feast for Crows versus say Lannister is the one who defaults on her loan on the Iron Throne's loan to the Iron Bank, and that's going to have a major impact on things going forward. So I think that's a part and parcel of George's style of writing A Song of Ice and Fire, that it makes it more interesting. They develop that these things develop organically. And so I think it's cool that we could see like stuff like the Faceless Men, stuff like the Iron Bank of Bravo, stuff like Syrio Forel's backstory potentially being expanded upon in universe as George imagines new and interesting ways to address these types of things.
I mean, I love a lot of that gardening style. I love that Euron comes out of nowhere halfway through the series and declares that he's going to take over everything, because I think that fits his character so perfectly. But yeah, with Bravos, the gears are a little too plain. Like when Cersei says she's defaulting on a loan to the Iron Bank, everyone says, well, that's ridiculous. You can't do that. They're the Iron Bank. And you go as a reader, well, if they're that important, why have none of you assholes brought them up before? If they have this much influence over Westerosi policy, if it's this important that you don't piss them off, why have they been completely in the background, if at all, until now? Exactly. So I think that is kind of obvious, but that does not prevent Martin from deploying those elements well later on in the series. Sure. So I am curious to see what larger role the Faceless Men and the Iron Bank have. But of course, in terms of Arya's storyline, all that's down the road. We have a very different Bravosi mentor for her to interact with in this chapter, and that is King of My Heart, Syrio Forel.
Oh my goodness. Syrio Forel in his last stand. So, oh my gosh, this chapter. All right. So, as we do in our regular podcast, you'll be getting the synopsis from us. We'll be talking about a little bit about it in depth a little bit afterwards, do a little theory discussion, and finally close out with the stupid, bad, ugly theory that needs to die. And it'll be a lot of fun, as you guys are well aware. And if you guys are interested in sticking around a little bit after the podcast, I think Emmett and I can take a few more questions and chat with you guys a little bit more if you're all are interested in it. But for now, this is the synopsis for A Game of Thrones, Arya 4. Syrio Forel slashes at Arya Stark towards her head, towards her left, towards her right, low, calling out each of the places he'll strike at with his wooden sword before he takes a swing at Arya. When Syrio lunges at Arya, she sidesteps and almost is able to land a hit on Syrio. They continue the water dance, left high, left right, left low, and then left before Syrio's wooden sword schwacks her from the right. Ow! Arya cries out in pain, but she thinks that this bruise, like all the other ones, will be a lesson for her, and lessons make you better. You are dead now, Syrio says. Yeah, only because you cheated, Arya angrily declares. You said left and you went right. Yep, and Syrio ain't sorry. Sure, he lied to Arya with his words, but his eyes and arms shouted the truth. When Arya protests that she was watching him closely, Syrio tells her that watching ain't seeing. Regardless, Syrio needs to unload some critical backstory on Arya before he dies. Syrio Forel was the first sword to the Sea Lord of Bravos, and you are knowing how that came to pass. Well, you were probably a pretty good swordsman, right? Arya asks. Well, yeah, Syrio was the fucking shit, but he wasn't the strongest, fastest, or youngest sword fighter. But what Syrio had instead was the ability to see things for how they truly were. In Bravos, ships brought all sorts of strange animals to the Sea Lord's palace. When the first sword of Bravos had died, the Sea Lord sent for Syrio along with many other Bravos. When Syrio met the Sea Lord, he had a fat cat in his lap, and the Sea Lord asked Syrio if he'd ever seen a girl cat like that before. Syrio had replied that, yeah, of course he had. He'd seen 1,000 cats like that. And so the Sea Lord had named Syrio the first sword of Bravos. Great story, Dad, but it makes no fucking sense. Arya doesn't exactly say. So Syrio explains a little bit better. The cat was an ordinary cat, no more. The others expected a fabulous beast, so that is what they saw. How large it was, they said. It was no larger than any other cat, only fat from indolence, for the Sea Lord fed it from his own table. What curious small ears, the other Bravos had said. Its ears had been chewed away in kitten fights, and it was plainly a tomcat. Yet the Sea Lord had said her, and that is what the others saw. Are you hearing? Ah, well, maybe you could have put it in something like that other than a goddamn riddle, Syrio. But Arya understands. Syrio saw what was there, just so. Open your eyes, Arya. The heart lies and the head plays tricks, but the eyes see true. Look with your eyes, hear with your ears, taste with your mouth, smell with your nose, feel with your skin. Then comes the thinking afterwards, and in that way, knowing the truth. Just so, Arya says, grinning. And then Syrio smiles at Arya and tells her that when they get back to Here we go again, Emmett. Winterfell. It'll be time to use this so-called needle. Oh, that'll be so much fun, Arya says. Wait till she, God damn it, wait till she shows John. Of course, George has to throw that in there. But then, just then, the wooden door behind Arya crashes open, and in walks in 5 Lannister Redcloaks, and Meryn Trant, a droopy-eyed shit-eater. He's armored up from being a traitorous son of a bitch who deserves to die in the throne room, but his Lannister toadies are only wearing mail shirts and steel caps with lion crests like a bunch of fucking dopes about to get their asses kicked hard. Meryn demands that Arya Stark comes with them, and Arya chews her lip for a second. What do you want? Meryn lies and says that her father wants to see her. Arya takes a step forward, but Syrio stops her. And why is it that Lord Eddard is sending Lannister men in his own place? I am wondering. Arya sees with her eyes. My father wouldn't send you. She picks up her stick sword. The Lannisters laugh like morons about to die, and Meryn gets all huffy about being a knight of the King's Guard. So was the Kingslayer, Arya says, when he killed the old king. I don't have to go with you if I don't want to. Sir, in quotation marks, Meryn, and it's in quotation marks because he's no true knight, orders the Lannister men to take Arya prisoner, and 3 of them move towards Arya and Syrio. Arya's afraid, but then she remembers Sirio's words. Fear cuts deeper than swords. Syrio steps out, a bit of a no chance and no choice moment, and starts tapping his wooden sword against his boot. You will be stopping there. Are you men or dogs that you would threaten a child? The Lannister dead men tell him to get the fuck out of the way, but Syrio smacks the first one with his sword upside the head. Great moment. Really enjoyed that. Syrio tells those youngins to speak to him with respect, and the dude Syrio just smacked tries to loosen his sword from his scabbard, but Syrio hits him hard. So satisfying. With his wooden sword breaking his idiot hand. You are quick for a dancing master, Meryn says, like a coward in full armor and behind his Lannister toadies. You are slow for a knight, Syrio throws back. The other 4 Lannister men unsheathe their swords and start circling the dancing master like vultures. Syrio tells Arya that they're done dancing for the day. She needs to run to her father. And now. Arya didn't want to rule out, but when Syrio spoke, she obeyed. Swift as a deer, she says. She retreats a ways back, but she still watches what's happening, and she suddenly realizes that Syrio was really only toying with Arya in all of her dancing lessons, because Syrio is about to bring an ungodly shitstorm of dancing ferocity down on those bozos. Arya watches the Lannisters, noticing the vulnerabilities in spaces where they weren't armored well, or armored at all for that matter. Their eye sockets, their legs, their hands. Syrio didn't wait for them to reach him. He spins left, kicking and whirling his way about, cracking the faces and legs of the Lannisters. Syrio ducks under a sword swipe and brings his wooden sword up and through the eye of one of the red cloaks. All of the Lannisters are down, but a few of them try to get up. The man whose hand Syrio had broken tries to stab Syrio with his dagger, but Syrio rings his bell and then bashes his kneecap. Again, super fucking satisfying. The final red cloak curses, charges, and hacks at Syrio, but Syrio ducks, dodges, dives, and dodges before bringing his wooden sword at the man's neck and shoulder. The Lannister man tries to bring his long sword up, but Syrio crushes his windpipe with his wooden sword, and the man dies gasping for air and clutching at his neck. Whew, man, it just makes my heart just go like that. Arya backs into a corner as 5 Lannister dudes are dead or dying in the room, but before she gets away, she sees Meryn Trant drawing his long sword. Arya, child, be gone now, Syrio says, never taking his eyes off Meryn. Arya knows that doom is approaching Syrio. She screams at Syrio to run, but would Syrio Forel, first sword of Braavos, run? Abso-fucking-lutely not. The first sword of Braavos does not run. Syrio dances away from Meryn's cuts. He checks 3 of Meryn's sword swings, but the 4th breaks Syrio's wooden sword. But before Arya can see what happens next, she runs sobbing from the room. Arya runs through the kitchens, blind and panicky. She pushes through a baker's boy holding loaves of fresh baked bread. A butcher with his arms red to his elbows tries to block her, but she spins around him. She runs and runs and runs, thinking of all the words that Syrio had taught her. Finally, she reaches a crossroads at the turret stair. Should she go up? Or maybe down? Up would take her to the Tower of the Hand, and down would take her on uncertain paths. Never do what they expect, she remembers Syrio telling her once. She heads down the stairs, and good thing that she does. Arya reaches the cellar with no exit. She sheathes her wooden sword and leaps atop the barrels until she finally finally finds a window. She pulls herself up, and I have to note that that's really good upper body strength, Arya. Way to do your pull-ups in the gym class. And finally, she's in daylight. Oh, man, this chapter. Sorry. I lost it for a second. There we go. Arya stands in the bailey of the Tower of the Hand, and Arya immediately sees that everything is terrible. The wooden door to the Tower of the Hand had been broken apart by axes, and there was a dead man face down on the steps to the Tower of the Hand. Worse, the man was wearing gray wool, Stark colors. She doesn't know who the man is, but she's terrified. No, she whispered. What was happening? Where was her father? Why had the Red Cloaks come for her? She thinks back to watching Varys and Illyrio down in the dungeons. If one hand can die, why not a second? Arya begins crying, but she holds her breath and hears with her ears. She hears the sounds of battle, shouts, screams, steel on steel, and it's all coming from the Tower of the Hand. She couldn't go back to the tower, but what about Dad? What about her father, Ned? She closes her eyes and tries to think, despite the tear in her gut. They'd already killed Jory, Will, and Heward. They could kill Ned too. And her? Yeah, they could kill Arya. Sure, she could play at being a water dancer, but that really wouldn't get her anywhere right now. Meryn had probably killed Syrio Forel, and she was only a scared girl with a wooden sword, alone and afraid. Arya gets out into the deserted castle yard, thinking that everybody is probably hiding from the fighting. She looks up to her bedchamber longingly, very longingly, for just a moment before moving away from the Tower of the Hand. She stays in shadow, moving along the buildings, knowing that they'd kill her if they found her. A dozen gold cloaks come running, but Arya, smart as she is, doesn't declare herself to them. She doesn't know whose side they're on, and man, is that really good that she didn't declare herself to them. She makes it to the stables and finds Hullen, her father's stable master, slumped over with a dozen stab wounds. She thinks he's dead, but when she approaches, his eyes open. Arya underfoot, you must. Warned you, your lord father. He coughs up blood, and then he dies. Within the stable itself are more dead bodies. A groom and three of her father's guards are dead. They were probably protecting an abandoned wagon that was being loaded for the voyage home. Among the dead is Desmond. Remember him from Arya 3? The Stark guardsman who had promised Arya that he'd protect her father and boasted that every northerner is worth 10 of these southern swords? Jesus, this chapter. Enraged, Arya kicks the body, accusing the dead man of lying to her. And I just have to say, it's really brutal, emotional. It's a very brutal, emotional moment for Arya, but it's really brutal for the reader as well because, this guy's dead, and it's just really sad. Arya's plan originally was to saddle a horse and ride like hell up the King's Road back to Winterfell, and she does start to take a saddle and bridle off the wall to mount a horse, but then a chest catches her eye. It's her chest, the one with her silks, velvets, and Needle. She gets down into the dirt and starts digging through everything, looking for Needle, but to no avail. Maybe someone had stolen it, but then her hands grasp the cold metal just in time. There she is, a voice hisses close behind Arya. Arya whirls about and comes face to face with a smirking stable boy holding a pitchfork. She asks who he is. Well, he ain't given his name, but he sure as shit knows who Arya is. Arya asks him to help him stable a horse. He's if you do that, you get a reward from Ned if you help. No, he ain't about to do that. Ned's dead, Arya. He's going to take her to Cersei. He lunges for her, and Arya forgets all about the training that Syrio had given her. Instead, she remembers the words of her bastard half-brother, actually her cousin, Jon Snow. Stick him with the pointy end. Arya plunges Needle into the gut of the stable boy. He drops his pitchfork, gasping, sighing. Take it out, he moans. His blood begins staining his tunic. Arya does, and the stable boy dies. But now all of the horses are screaming, and Arya needs to get the fuck out of here fast, quick, fast, in a hurry. She'd been saddling a horse herself, but then she realizes that the gates and doors of the Red Keep would be closed and locked. She thinks about how she could escape before she finally comes onto an idea. She'll go through the tunnels below the Red Keep, just like she did back in Arya 3. Arya wasn't certain she knew the way exactly, but she had no other choice. She had to try. She slips into some of her clothes and secures Needle. But to get to the edge of the tunnels, she had to cross the castle courtyard in broad daylight. No more shadows. But she has, again, no other choice. She peers out and sees gold cloaks on the walls. What would happen if they saw her running? Would they see her? Would they care? She decides she has to get going anyways. But instead of running, the voice of Syrio Forel seems to whisper in her ear, calm as still water, quiet as a shadow. Arya steps into the light and walks across the courtyard in full view of the entirety of the Red Keep. It's fucking terrifying, and she knows that people are looking at her and she's being seen. But she also knows that if she runs, she'll get her ass captured. She walks and walks and walks. And finally, she gets to the sept on the far side of the castle courtyard. As Arya makes her way through the tunnel, Arya crawls in and out of the windows of the septs, and it takes her over an hour to find the same window that she had crawled through to escape Tom and Marcella and the Lannister guards a little while back. But finally, she's through. She lights a candle, and then she sees the monsters again. Only this time, the monsters don't scare her. They were almost like old friends. Dragons, she whispers at them as she draws Needle. Arya felt better holding Needle, and I have to say, I feel better with Arya holding Needle. So, good job, Arya. As Arya makes her way through the tunnel, she remembers the stable boy slumped over dead. She has a sudden fear that the dead boy might reach out from the darkness and grab her. She thinks about blowing her candle out, but then Syrio Forel's words, "Fear cuts deeper than swords," come back to her again. She remembers the crypts of Winterfell and how much more terrifying they were than the tunnels below the Red Keep. You see, back at Winterfell, long time ago, before even Rickon had been born, Robb had taken Arya, Sansa, Bran down to the crypts. They saw the statues and direwolves staring at them. They passed the statues of Lord Rickard Stark, his son Brandon Stark, Ned's brother, and Lyanna's crypt. Old Nan had warned them that there would be rats as big as hounds down there. Well, as big as dogs, what they said, but I just wanted to throw that big as hounds reference there. But Robb had told them that that really wasn't the need to fear. This is where the dead walk. And then a low moaning noise had begun echoing off the walls. A spirit stepped into the open, pale, white, and moaning for blood. Sansa had shrieked and run like a sane person, and guys, look at me again, being ever so fair to Sansa, because you're supposed to fucking run when you see a ghost coming at you in the dark. Bran had grabbed Robb's leg and bawled, but Arya stood her ground and punched the spirit square in the stomach. It wasn't a spirit after all. It was Jon, covered in flour. "You stupid," Arya told Jon. "You scared the baby." But Robb and Jon had only lolled at that joke, and soon Arya and Bran were laughing too. The memory makes Arya smile now deep inside the darkness of the tunnels under the Red Keep. The dark wasn't scary to her anymore. If the ghost of the stable boy jumped out at her, Arya would kill the boy all over again. She was done with this shit and done with this place. Done with the castle, done with King's Landing. She was going the fuck home to Winterfell. Arya plunges forward into and through the darkness, unafraid. And that is a Game of Thrones Arya 4. I guess the best way to put it is this is a huge chapter, both in terms of its actual size. I mean, the summary itself, as I'm looking at this Google document, is about 6 pages long, but it's much more huge in terms of how it's working in Arya's arc and kind of her plot as well. And much like Eddard 14, this chapter very much feels like the climax to Arya's A Game of Thrones arc, with her final chapter serving as basically like the epilogue, sort of like Eddard 15 does the same way for Ned's story. And man, I got to say this, Emmett, I love the Jesus out of this chapter. I hope you do the same.
I also love our non-denominational God out of this chapter, Jeff. Absolutely. This is my second favorite chapter in this first book, behind only Sansa 2, and it features my single favorite set piece in this book. Even more than the Tower of Joy or the Whispering Wood or the birth of Dany's dragon, Syrio Forel's Last Stand is it for me. It's the most exciting, the most perfectly written, the most resonant in terms of theme and character, and it's not even the only great thing about this chapter. As you say, it's a long one, and every part of it works. Arya is, of course, the underfoot character in A Game of Thrones. She has the fewest POV chapters of anybody, and she doesn't really have a distinct arc unto herself, but everything comes together here. And this chapter is really where I got interested in Arya as a POV, and where everything I love about her story in the books to come is established.
Yeah, it's really good that way. And I do love this as a huge culmination of her arc and how she uses the different aspects of what her mentors namely being Jon Snow, Ned Stark, and then Syrio had taught her throughout a Game of Thrones. And so one of the things I did today, actually, before I came onto this podcast and this live cast, is that I skimmed Arya's A Game of Thrones chapters prior to coming on. And I love how each of the major plot beats calls back to events and teachings that Arya received throughout A Game of Thrones. I mean, the obvious one is, of course, Jon's sticking with the pointy end, which is what she does with the butcher's boy. But another, like, kind of very minor thing is that when Ned talks with her in Arya 2 and tells her, like, we are in a really dangerous fucking place. Like, we need to be extraordinarily cautious and not call attention to ourselves and not do things that are going to be seen as bad for us. You just need to be careful. Like, I was thinking about that when Arya is looking at the gold cloaks that are running through the castle courtyard, a very minor scene. And that seemed to me to be kind of a callback to that moment with Ned there. And then, of course, we have Syrio Forel's teachings all kind of coming together here. And so much so that by the end, or by the middle half of this chapter, Arya begins believing, having, I don't know if you want to call it an auditory hallucination, but she begins believing that that Syrio is speaking to her with his own voice. So she has all of these different sayings about Syrio. Fear cuts deeper than swords being the major one, kind of just echoing throughout her mind as she's going through this really scary, terrifying chapter in A Game of Thrones, and really scary, terrifying moment in her storyline. But yeah, it really starts though with this huge moment of suspense of, because we had just finished Ned Stark's chapter where he is arrested and his men die around him, and then boom, we're like right there with Arya Stark, and you're like waiting for shit to go down in this chapter.
Yeah, that's the great thing about it, because if you look at this opening scene of the chapter on its own merits, it's just a classic sports coach scene, right? It's just dueling and mentoring and getting better at your abilities and getting ready. It's like you could feel like getting ready for the big game kind of scene. It's feel good on the surface, but it wears this veil of dread because it comes right on the heels of Eddard 14, in which her father went down. And we know, even as first-time readers, this is going to have some huge ramifications for Arya, even if we don't know the form it takes. We're watching play fighting between Arya and Syrio with the knowledge that the real thing is going down in the throne room, right? That the men that Arya played with at Winterfell are dying. And there's that added layer of sadness that you got at in your summary, and that we know, again, even as first-time readers, that there's probably no way in hell that Arya and Sansa are getting on that ship now. Right. So her anticipation of going home just withers on the vine for us as readers. I mean, this hurts. She would have a fresh bruise there by the time she went to sleep somewhere out at sea. But as you said, not nearly as bad as this hurts. Syrio Forel allowed himself a smile. I am thinking that when we are reaching this Winterfell of yours, it will be time to put this needle in your hand. Yes, Arya said eagerly. Wait till I show Jon.
Oh my God.
That's like a needle in your heart, appropriately enough.
Oh man, it just reminds me of that line from that awful Hobbit movie. Why does it hurt so bad? Because it was real. And I mean, like it's. You're absolutely right. And, you know, even for us now that we're in 2019, season 7, which is like basically the last version of A Song of Ice and Fire-ish that we saw, we haven't seen Arya and Jon reunite yet. We saw Jon and Sansa reunite, which is, again, like we were saying last week or the week before, an extraordinarily touching moment in the story. I mean, I'm really, really, one of the things I'm most excited about for season 8 is Jon and Arya reuniting. But here, just taking a look at the 5 published books in A Song of Ice and Fire, they're very, very far apart. I mean, Jon is dead for that matter. Arya's in Bravos. I mean, Jon will come back, of course. Arya will, of course, come back to
dead. Westeros. Yeah,
dead, but not quite. Actually, he is totally dead, but he'll come back. The thing is that yeah, it's the emotions that are just piping through this chapter are so intense, and I do think. This is not a ding against George, because I'm similar in kind of my own writing style, and that it's much, I find I write a lot of sad moments much easier than writing these happy moments. Then we did get that kind of happier Jon chapter 2 weeks ago where George is able to write, you know, happy moments in the story. And I think like people that say that Song of Ice and Fire is grimdark or awful and deserve to be shot into space aboard a toy rocket. But at the same time, like he does do a really good job of just kind of amping up the amount of emotional sadness involved with the arcs of these characters. Like Arya is saying that, oh, I'm going to have the chance to go see, wait till I show Jon my needle and my new abilities. And like, that hasn't happened yet. I mean, hopefully maybe in season 8, Arya will be able to demonstrate some of her abilities. I mean, we did see that fantastic fight scene between Arya and Brienne in season 7. Maybe she'll have the ability to show to show Jon her new abilities and her new faceless men, I guess, changing faces sort of thing. I think Jon would be freaked the fuck out, but at the same time,
Probably.
you do think this is probably going to be an interesting moment in either The Winds of Winter, Dream of Spring, and or season 8, where Jon and Arya reunite. It's probably going to be one of the most touching moments in all of Song of Ice and Fire.
I love that about Arya finally getting to show Jon what she can do and him being impressed by it. I could see that being a perfect heart-melting moment upon their reunion. And yeah, we get a lot of lingering moments in this chapter before the hammer falls. We really get Syrio Forel this chance to present himself as a teacher because he's imparting true wisdom to his charge. He doesn't just lie to her about where that blow is coming from to get her to pay attention to what he's actually doing. He sits her down and talks her through the wider implications of that moment. Can you imagine Alistair Thorne ever being as effective an instructor? No, you cannot. And of course, those wider implications include what's going on with Dad. I mean, rereading this chapter, it stood out so strongly to me as a parallel with Eddard 14, in which you have Syrio's story about being marched into the Hall of Power and Bravos to the Sea Lord and being asked to say what he thought about this creature in the seat of power, this cat. And that's exactly what happened to Ned. He was marched into the Hall of Power and said plainly the truth, as Syrio did, about what was sitting in front of him. Damn the consequences. Yep. Joffrey is the yellow cat, the Lannister lion. That's and Ned was being asked to call Joffrey his king, despite that being a lie, just as so many were being asked to overpraise this darn cat on the Sea Lord's lap. And just like Arya, Ned was deceived as to where the blow was coming from. It came from Littlefinger and Janos Slynt, despite being told differently. But of course, Ned's truth is not just a sharp lesson like it is for Arya. Ned's truth brings him a cost that's far more than just a bruise. So that's the transition from childhood to adulthood we've been talking about throughout this book. The moment when the scales fall, that's what this is for Arya. And Syrio is telling Arya to see through that golden veil over the eyes that we talked about in Sansa 2, that filter from the stories and the songs. He's saying to her, you have to know the truth about the world. Do not hide, do not flinch. You have to know the thing in itself. That's the most important lesson you can take from me. And I think that's just perfect.
Yeah, I think it is perfect. And again, it's fantastic. It's something I never saw in this chapter before about Syrio Forel's story being very much a metaphor for what we see with Ned Stark in the last chapter of having to declare.
Yes.
I mean, that's a fantastic point. This is why you're my co-host. This is why you're the one that everybody likes on the podcast. But no, it's a great point. I mean, I think it's really interesting in that, like, the idea of like seeing with your eyes sort of thing, like before you have to make like a conscious like A to B decision making tree in your head, that you're instinctively you're able to make those decisions on your own using your senses before you actually have to put significant intellectual thought into it. And I think that's a really smart point on Syrio Forel's part. And it really is a lesson that does great work for Arya, in that, you know, Arya does all of these major moves in this chapter, moving from the castle courtyard to the Sept, not going up the stairs to the Tower of the Hand, you know, using the tunnels underneath of the Red Keep. And these are, you know, Arya does put some thought into them, but they're also essentially instinctive things, because when she, like, take the decision whether she's supposed to go up or down at the Tower of the Hand. She gives it a brief thought of she can go up to Ned or go down. She immediately thinks, she snaps to what Syrio Forel told her, which is that do the thing that your enemies would not expect you to do. So she goes down, and that has a really positive impact on her. So, I mean, and this is not to say that you shouldn't, you know, sit down and think about like long-term decisions and consequences and do a decision tree type thing. At the same time, though, in the heat of the moment where Arya's in, where she is in mortal peril and danger, she does have to make these quick decisions, and she does so using her senses throughout this chapter and doing it in such a way that she's able, of anyone in all of Ned Stark's retinue, to escape from the horrors that are befalling them as they're all dying in King's Landing, or will die in the case of Ned Stark, or be sold into sex slavery in the case of Jane Poole, or be held as a hostage in the case of Sansa Stark. So her quick-wittedness, her ability to utilize her senses, does allow her to make a nearly clean getaway from this chapter.
Absolutely, and it's not just a lesson for children. Like, when we think about the great military minds of Westeros, one of the first ones that comes up is your namesake, Brandon Blackfish. Brynden Tully of River Run. And what does he say is the number one rule of warfare? Never give your enemy what they want, which is the exact same lesson Syrio is teaching Arya here. Never do what your enemy expects. Never give them what they're hoping for. Never hand the game over to them. And I think, again, that's a lesson you have to learn when you're crossing from childhood into adulthood, like the speech Ned gave Arya and Arya 2 about the wolf pack. And I think what we see when Arya is eagerly talking about going home to show Jon, that's her childhood right there. That's the best moment in her childhood. That's the dream she wants. And then the door crashes open and Meryn Trant walks in. and Arya's childhood comes crashing down. This
Right.
endless fall that mirrors Bran's fall and will persist throughout Ned's execution and the Red Wedding. And I love the little detail that when Meryn Trant says, Arya Stark, come with us, child. At first, she trusts him. She's about to
Right.
just walk over instinctively, like you say. This very Sansa-esque trust of authority and the figures of knighthood. But then Syrio reminds her to follow what he just taught her. Look with your eyes. Think through this situation. And then she specifically invokes Jaime to see through that institution in the White Cloaks. And then, as you said, Meryn immediately proves himself to be no true knight, to borrow Sansa's phrase, by going after her in force. And that, of course, is when we see Syrio step up to the plate. And again, it's a manner that directly recalls Ned. You will be stopping there. Are you men or dogs that you would threaten a child? Once again, it's mercy for the kids that animates our heroes. But while Ned's story is all desperate tragedy, Syrio is this great, larger-than-life figure right out of the song. He's just a legend. I am Syrio Forel, and you will now be speaking to me with more respect. The tone is a little different from Ned. Here we're seeing how an actual legend, an actual character out of the songs would manifest in such a situation. And of course, he promptly goes full Obi-Wan in the cantina / Master Po from Kung Fu on the Red Cloaks, just taking them apart. And Arya, of course, has to experience that realization that all mentees in genre fiction have to face, the realization that, oh, he wasn't showing me a fraction of what he could do.
Right.
Watching him now, she realized that Syrio had only been toying with her when they dueled, which that has to happen for every young protagonist in genre fiction. You have to realize that your mentor has abilities you never dreamed of. Again, that's part of crossing the threshold to adulthood.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I was thinking about this because, today, on Mondays, I'm off from work typically, and I was wrestling with my daughters, my 2-year-old and my 1-year-old, and I was imagining that being a moment for Arya where I don't know, being a big strong man as I am, actually seeing me fighting for real, which wouldn't happen because I'm a lover, not a fighter. Some of the time, I guess. But I do think that's a really great point, is that she's seeing Syrio Forel as this guy who's training her, but he's also he's very much paring down his abilities, right? He's operating at 10% level because she's the way the choreography that George integrates into his fighting style, he's flashing and ducking and dodging and diving and all the things from Dodgeball, from great movie from 2003 or 2004. He's fantastic in his style and his fighting, and it's just Arya's in complete wonderment and amazement. And you have that line from earlier in the chapter where Arya thinks she almost landed a blow on Syrio, and you're like, but did she really? But did she? Probably not. But I mean, it helps her to feel better about her abilities, and she does grow in her water dancing. She does get better over time, and she does utilize Needle in a deadly way at the end of this, towards the end of this chapter here. But yeah, it's really a fantastic point that that Syrio, though, is still a mentor figure, right? He's operates not quite the same role as Ned Stark, as you say, but mentor figures have to die in order to allow their proteges to go on. Qui-Gon Jinn had to die in order to allow Obi-Wan to go on. Obi-Wan had to die in order to allow Luke Skywalker to progress in his training as a Jedi. These are the ways that narrative fiction works and how narratives progress for the characters. And Syrio isn't a POV character. Arya Stark is. And her watching Syrio fight and watching Syrio die, holding off the Lannisters from taking Arya hostage and taking her prisoner, potentially killing her, which you do kind of, not necessarily, it's not Arya's fault that she doesn't recognize that the Lannisters probably would not kill her, that they needed her alive for a hostage. But that's a very real fear on her part. And it's a very understandable, realistic, rational fear on her part. But at the same time, though, Syrio does have to die in order to allow Arya to progress in her narrative and progress in her arc.
And Luke Skywalker has to die to allow Rey to progress in her arc in the undisputed cinematic masterpiece, Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi. But yeah, like I say, the emphasis is on childish beliefs falling away. Arya clings to that wooden sword when Syrio is engaging in his fight, that just like the stick she'll break when she declares that she's all grown up in Harrenhal at the end of Clash of Kings. I am a direwolf and done with wooden teeth. It's all part of that arc. And what really elevates this scene for me and allows it to exemplify A Song of Ice and Fire as a whole is after the Red Cloaks are all down or dying, and Sir Meryn Trant steps in personally to take Syrio down. And there's this moment where Arya looks. She follows Syrio's advice. She looks and she sees, and what she sees, past the myths, past the stories and the songs, is that it's not going to matter that Syrio Forel is the greatest swordsman alive and that Meryn Trant is never more than mediocre. And why doesn't it matter? Because Meryn is armored from head to toe. and he has castle forged steel, and Syrio has a stick. So
Right.
he may as well be naked with no weapon but his fists, for all that's going to matter against what Meryn can bring to the table. His skill and all his training is not going to avail him against this hard reality. And I think it's so important that Martin brings that to the table as well. He says, yes, we love Syrio. We love the training he's imparted to Arya, but I'm not going to pretend he's just so magical and wonderful. He can break the laws of reality and
Right.
take down a guy in armor with a stick. And
Right.
that's what makes the Song of Ice and Fire so special, is including both of those perspectives. I think that's so crucial to making this chapter work.
You're absolutely right in that, like, in like lesser fiction, you can imagine Syrio Forel like somehow killing Meryn Trant right there with a wooden stick. But Martin wants to ground the heroism of Syrio Forel very much in realistic confines, and that he's not going to survive the battle with Meryn Trant, as we'll talk about at the end of this podcast. But at the same time, it's really good on George's part that he writes a way that Syrio Forel, even though he's not going to make it out alive, that he's giving Meryn Trant like a bit of a fight on his hands with a wooden stick. I mean, like, right. I mean, like, Meryn Trant's eventually going to kill him, but at the same time, like, he blocks 3 of his cuts before the 4th one finally shatters or cuts his wooden stick in half. So I think it's really good that we have that there, that really makes us do, have that emotional reaction to Syrio Forel, and that he stands his ground. Like, he's very much like Brienne here. It's no chance and no choice for him. And he doesn't run. The first Sword of Bravos doesn't run. And I think, like, it's a badass line, and I love the line so much, but it's not just a badass line just in isolation. It's not in a vacuum. What it does more than anything else is that it is demonstrating his role as a hero, in that his no chance, no choice moment is him standing up to a Kingsguard knight armored in everything that he could possibly be wearing, in order to save the life, in order to protect Arya Stark. And I think that's really, really vital in understanding Syrio Forel's role in the story. He's saving an innocent here. He's protecting an innocent. He's not just uttering badass lines like Clint Eastwood in an old Western. I mean, you do kind of get a little bit of an old Western feel with Syrio Forel and his lines, but it's not like he's after gold or anything like that. He's a true hero because he's doing a good thing in order on behalf of an innocent, on behalf of someone that he cares about. And I think that's awesome.
As I've said before, the central tone of the series as a whole, arguably, but definitely this first book, is the meeting point of romanticism and realism. What happens when you collide them.
Right.
And that while the latter wins in the short term, the author's heart is ultimately with the former. That, yes, he's not going to magically allow Syrio to survive this situation that he can't realistically survive, but we too, as with Arya, are meant to see with our eyes and realize that this is what heroism truly looks like, even, especially, if it doesn't save Syrio's life. I mean, it's the same thing with Ned. The takeaway is not just that it's foolish and stupid to try to embrace mercy, and you should just embrace, to quote Sandor, that strong arms and steel swords rule this world. Because in this moment, with his final breaths, Syrio Forel insists that being the first Sword of Bravos is not about being the quickest or the deadliest. Right. Being the first Sword of Bravos means you do not run.
Yes.
It is not your abilities that make you who you are, Harry Potter. It is your choices.
Right.
And the word choice that Martin uses is so perfect. Syrio does not say that. He does not call out the first Sword of Bravos does not run. He sings it. That's the word choice Martin uses. How perfect is that? Syrio Forel gets to sing his Song of Ice and Fire and live it. He knows himself perfectly in his final moments, and he gets to go down as his best possible self. How many of us get to do that? He's right to put his life on the line for Arya, just as Ned was for Cersei's kids, just as Davos will be for Edric Storm, and, as you say, Brienne for the kids at the inn in A Feast for Crows. And after all, Jaime didn't personally defeat that bear at Harrenhal in hand-to-hand combat and then ride the bear into battle as his victorious steed. Like, that's not what happened. Like, the way the bear died in that encounter was actually kind of cynical and political. Like, Bolton's men killed it with arrows because Jaime is too valuable to let die, and then Vargo Hoat couldn't do anything except scream, "You flew my bear," because, Bolton's men outnumbered him. Very grounded, very realistic, very cynical. But what matters is that Jaime made the choice. That's what makes our hearts leap when he jumps in to save Brienne. You want her, go get her. So he did. Right. That's what makes that moment powerful, not him being able to master the situation through sheer force of will. It's the decision he makes. That's what makes that moment powerful, and that's what makes this moment powerful. And that's why, for me, this scene exemplifies everything I love about this series. But I've been talking forever. You stop me gushing. So.
Please, just keep on talking forever. I could listen to you talk forever. That's for sure.
Well, You don't say.
No, but I mean, like that's it's really good. I mean, like realism is not always grim dark. Like your actual lives are not just a series of terrible things happening one after the other after the other. Like it has to be intermixed with the happy moments, and it has to be intermixed with romanticism as well. And I think like Martin, as the bads are always talking about, is writing these stories of like, aha, look at me doing these terrible things to these good people like Ned Stark, like Syrio Forel. But that's not what's happening with Ned Stark, with Syrio Forel, with Davos Seaworth, with Brienne of Tarth. What they're doing is they're operating out of a inner nobility, not one that's been granted them by their titles, not one that's been handed down to them by their father before them or their brother in the case of Ned. What Martin is doing here is showing true humanity and true nobility within these characters, and that they stand up for what's right and they fight for what's right. And damn be the consequence in the case of Syrio Forel. The first sword of Bravos doesn't run. I love that line. I love that line more because of what it means. It means that Syrio is not going to run and allow Arya Stark to be captured by Meryn Trant and be handed over to the Lannisters to potentially be killed. And I think that's fantastic. It's a fantastic send off for Syrio Forel, and it just does so much great work in both in also crafting Arya's future story, because she is always consistently, as we're going to be talking about here in Arya's 5th chapter in A Game of Thrones, and throughout Clash and Storm and Feast and Dance and The Winds of Winter, she's always going to be calling back to Syrio Forel, because that's a life worth living towards. That's a life worth exemplifying in your own life.
Yeah, it's so important to have this on the line before Arya gets into her later mentors. This resonates so strongly with Yoren throwing down his life on the line for her, with Beric Dondarrion dying over and over and over again to protect the small folk. This is the model Arya runs both to and from over the rest of the story. And when Syrio goes down here and tells her to run, she starts running, and she really hasn't stopped since. That's her whole story now.
Mm-hmm.
She has these layovers at Harrenhal and the House of Black and White and so on, but she really never stops running,
No.
never stops trying to find a safe place after this, because she can't. Her oasis has been destroyed. And I love this nightmarish blur of images we get as she runs. She runs into this butcher whose arms are like red to the elbow,
Right.
which just fits the horrible, blood-soaked, nightmarish tone of this chapter so well. We, of course, get the bloodshed at the Tower of the Hand with the door hammered open by Sandor, as we will learn in Sansa 4, and one man lying dead. And, of course, we get Hullen's final moments when he's just covered with blood and still trying to tell Arya to warn her Lord Father, still loyal to Ned, the man who treated him like a person in his dying moments. That's just so devastating and so perfect, and grounds us, because, of course, as first-time readers, we're just coming off Edward 14. Like I said, we're just catching up with this whole downfall situation. So this is just as nightmarish for us as it is for her.
Yeah, it really is a nightmare going forward. I mean, you have to contrast the heroism of Syrio Forel and that kind of romantic outlook with the horrors that she's seeing all around her, because as we talked about in Eddard 14, like shit has gone real fucking bad for Ned Stark and his men there. Like the betrayal was absolute. I mean, the Gold Cloaks, the Lannisters, everyone was in on bringing Ned Stark and his men down. And, the one thing that just kind of really is, it's infuriating. I mean, as a modern reader and just as a reader in general, but uh, we'll be talking about this in Sansa's next chapter, which is next week's chapter. But it's infuriating that Arya, Sansa, and Ned's lives were worth saving and preserving. But what did Hullen do to deserve being like chopped down to pieces by Lannister guardsmen? He's a stable master. What did all of these guys, these servants of the Starks, what did they do in order to deserve a fate like this of being killed at sword point? And the only reason that they're killed at that they're all murdered essentially by the Lannisters and by the Gold Cloaks is because they don't have social status. They don't have the wealth or the family name of Stark behind them that can save their life, or temporarily in the case of Ned Stark, for the more long term in the case of Sansa and Arya. And I think that it's infuriating for readers, and it's really sad when Hullen is dead. I mean, again, he's just a stable master. He doesn't do anything besides take care of the horses. He's not carrying a sword, but they killed him anyways. They killed a non-combatant because they could, and because his status as a poor person and as a servant of the Starks allowed them to do so, and they allowed them to do so with impunity. There's no war crimes in Westeros necessarily. I mean, there is absolutely in real life, but there's no war crime tribunal or something like that to try these people for murdering civilians, and they can just do it. And that's what they do because they're Lannisters and they suck.
The absolute worst. Yeah, I agree. There's this sense of powerlessness and chaos we see unfold here, especially through Arya's eyes. There's that devastating moment when she kicks Desmond to express her fury, because that's the only outlet available to her to express her anger about what's happening. Much of Arya's story going forward is about her angry attempts to control her environment, whether that's using Jaqen's murder genie pact at Harrenhal to try to assert some control, whether her constant attempts in Storm of Swords to escape from the Brotherhood and Sandor to get back to her family, or even finally becoming an assassin in A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons at the House of Black and White, because at least that's some measure of control over an environment that has just kept spinning out of control for her ever since this moment. And all of this violent imagery, of course, culminates with the death of the stable boy, the first kill from Arya. Now, I don't think this makes Arya a bloodthirsty monster. It's in self-defense. She's a panicking child. She feels hideous about it immediately afterwards. I don't feel like she's Joffrey in this moment, but I think it's worth noting that it happens with Needle, her connection to Jon and Winterfell, her home, everything she loves about childhood. It's sullied in a way by this blood. And you think about the connection to Micah, the butcher's boy she loved, the friend she missed and mourned, and now she has, to secure her own escape, killed this other child who, as you say, is part of a class where he's not thinking about, oh, Stark versus Lannister, which side has the noble cause and which side was wrong. He's just thinking about who's going to feed me, who's going to benefit me, who can I find as a patron in this moment. And Arya is confronted with that harsh reality. And as I've been saying ad nauseum, there's the loss of useful innocence going on here. The horses are screaming. It reminds me of like Silence of the Lambs and how the association of screaming animals with that loss of that youthful innocence. And that story and many others. You know, I compared back in Eddard 12, the general tone of romanticism crashing into realism being similar to the tone in Watchmen of the image of the smiley face having just a drop of blood on it. And this is the moment that Arya's Watchman smiley face gets bloodied. I don't think it makes her a monster like I was saying, but this is a significant moment in terms of the loss of her innocence and the loss of her childhood in this chapter.
Yeah, it really is the loss of her innocence. This is her first kill. I mean, this is the first person that she kills, and I think it's justified, as you talked about. It's self-defense, but at the same time, it's killing. I mean, there's a great book called On Killing, which I do recommend that folks who are interested in the topic read, in which I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head. I know he was a lieutenant colonel in the Army. Basically went through the record of people who had killed in combat, right? At some level, it's a justified situation, and talking about how that impacts the psyche, even if it's utterly justified, like pulling the trigger for your firearm, your weapon, your rifle, whatever you're using, is going to have a significant impact in changing who you are. And Emma, you're right that Arya immediately feels guilty about it. At the same time, though, when she's down in like the tunnel, she thinks about if this guy comes back, if the stable boy comes back up, he's going to she's going to stab the shit out of him again and kill him again. And again, it's all rooted in her fear and her terror at what she's experiencing and what she's witnessed so far. But again, there at the end, when she's down in the tunnels, it is a bit of a thing where she is conquering her fear, and she's conquering her fear of what could be down in the tunnels, the darkness, the dragons, all of the different things that she's going through. And that kind of is a good way that Martin does to make this chapter much more full and fleshed out, is that as well as Arya experiencing that trauma of killing someone for the first time, she is also conquering her fears and, I guess, killing her fears. I don't know. That's probably a terrible transition, but I'm just going to go with it.
No, I agree. It's that very Stephen King tone of the child confronting the monsters that are the embodiments of their childhood fears, and that's how they grow up, sort of thing. The classic kind of horror novel formulation. And I like that Arya 4 ends on this very optimistic note, that for all that she's losing in this chapter, for all that the general tone is chaotic and bloody, her teachings from Syrio genuinely do help. They get her across the yard. They save her at the Tower of the Hand, like you were saying. And the memory of home is what gets her out of the castle despite the dragon skulls. There's this moment when she's panicking. She's like, the ghost of the stable boy is going to get me. What do I do? What do I do? And you can see her just running in circles or shouting for help and getting caught. But she remembers home. She remembers a place where, to quote Bloodraven, darkness will make you strong, the crypts and family and love and laughter. And I love that focus on, quote, fear cuts deeper than swords. And so as with Sirio's fable about the cat in Bravos, the focus shifts from what the world is doing to Arya to how she responds. What is she going to do with it? You know, we all live in difficult times, but The question is what you do with the time that is given to you, to paraphrase Lord of the Rings. And it's on this note that Arya becomes a much more central character in her own right. As I said earlier, she really is very much in the background in this first book. But when you get to Clash of Kings, she gets twice as many chapters as she does in this first book, more than anyone except Tyrion. Yeah. And she really becomes a driving narrative force in her own right. And I think you can see that beginning here. I think you can see Martin's conception of Arya and what he wants to do with her thematically just locking into place by the end of this chapter.
Yeah, I mean, essentially what happens to Arya in this chapter gives her the narrative agency to begin making decisions on her own. Now, in Clash, of course, as we're going to be finding out, she is a little bit restrained by characters like Yoren, who has forcibly taking her up to Winterfell. And then later on, when she's captured, she is taken to Harrenhal, and she has to serve the Lannisters. But even there, she's developing her agency more and more. She's utilizing Jack and Nagar and in order to kill Lannister retainers, and then eventually to get her way out of Harrenhal itself. And then she has the same thing where she's a captive of Sandor Clegane and the Brotherhood Without Banners and these different types of organizations and groups. And you can make the case too that Arya is a bit of a captive of the Faceless Men in a Feast for Crows and a Dance with Dragons. So I'm very curious what's going to happen with Arya in the Winds of Winter when she finally makes that break from the Faceless Men, which everybody knows is coming. If you think that Arya is going to stay in Braavos, man, I don't know what to tell you. But when she does make that break from the Faceless Men and mix it back to Westeros, I think it's going to be a further permutation of this agency that Martin's embedding into Arya's arc and allowing her to make decisions and not just be a background character, but be a central character. I mean, it's no, in my mind, Martin has said things in the past like that Arya is his second favorite point of view character after Tyrion Lannister. And I can't imagine a position where Martin would be in where he would want to have Arya fade back into the background again. I think she's going to continue to be a central character. And we do know from a recently unearthed interview between the guy who did the maps for the Lands of Ice and Fire that Arya has a bunch of chapters in the Winds of Winter set in Braavos. And this guy actually used those chapters to craft the map of Braavos itself. That's why George R. Martin sent those chapters to him. So I think we're going to continue to see Arya's chapter count increasing ever upwards. Of course, in Dance, we only had 2 chapters. I think we'll probably be back to like 10 to 15 chapters in the Winds of Winter, Volume 1 maybe, and then another 25 chapters in Volume 2. I don't know. We'll see.
I hope so. And on that note, we're going to shift to the foreshadowing and groundwork section of the podcast. First and most obviously, that scene with Jon in the crypts, covering himself with flour and pretending to be a ghost, that's just going to resonate so strongly with Jon's story as we go. Not only in his constant dream of the crypts, but also in the name of his wolf ghost and the fact that he himself ends up a corpse, albeit temporarily, at the end of A Dance with Dragons. So I think you're going to have to remind me, because you know this stuff better than me, that there's been confirmation that Martin always planned to have Jon die, or it's been brought up in some capacity before. Am I completely wrong? I can always be completely wrong.
No, Martin has said things like he was in an interview with James Hibberd right after the publication of A Dance with Dragons, and he said that the line "Daggers in the Dark" was something that he had written back in like 2001 when he was first starting writing what was then A Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons combined into A Dance with Dragons. I think like we also, as we talked about in our Brand 2 chapter, or Brand 3 chapter rather, that Bran seeing Jon in an ice cell getting cold, that sort of imagery has always been, I've always taken to be foreshadowing that Jon was always intended to die at some point, and then the resurrection angle. I'm curious when the resurrection angle came about, whether that was something that Martin had imagined from the get-go or something that he developed as he was going along when we're getting to Clash and Storm and you have the resurrection of Beric Dondarrion. And of course, you can also make just to kind of throw that out the window, you can make the case that Daenerys Targaryen walking into the fire at the end of a Game of Thrones could be seen as something that that George R. Martin was planning for Jon. But I'm not entirely sure on that angle necessarily. But I do think that he always intended Jon to die and to be a ghost. Jon's direwolf was named Ghost from the get-go. That
exactly
is fantastic foreshadowing for Jon's eventual fate come the end of A Dance with Dragons.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said there, especially at the end. The next little bit of potential foreshadowing and groundwork we see here is that Arya forges this close connection with dragon skulls. So this, among a few other mentions of dragons in Arya's storyline, have led people to wonder whether she's going to become involved with live dragons at some point in her story. She's in Essos, after all. Her Faceless Men bosses seem to be after the death of dragons, given what the former Jaqen Hagar is up to in Old Town. And they may have received their very own dragon egg from Euron Crowseye in payment for the assassination of Big Daddy Balon Greyjoy.
Oh, yeah.
So This is one of those things where I'm intrigued but frustrated by Arya Storyline and Bravos, because I could see that becoming a thing, but I just don't see the space for it in
Right.
2 books if we also have to do a story of getting Arya back to Westeros and dealing with Lady Stoneheart and getting Nymeria and reuniting with her siblings, blah, 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 blah. Like, that's just a lot in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean,
Having her involved with Dany and her dragons. If she does, I think it's going to be in the process of both Arya and Dany arriving in Westeros. I don't think there's another self-contained associate plot in the works for Arya. Or I hope there's not,
yeah,
as much as I
same.
enjoy Bravos. I just don't think there's room for it.
Well, there's the major theory, the theory that I think you and I both are fans of, is that Arya will return to Westeros via Justin Massey, who in the
Yeah.
Theon sample chapter for the Winds of Winter is heading off to Bravos to collect cell swords to operate on behalf of Stannis. And then it's possible that Arya could take a ship with Justin Massey to get back to Westeros, and that is the way that she gets back. There is a second theory that's worth mentioning here, which is the idea that Arya will join up with Daenerys and her company when they get to, a place like Pentos in the Winds of Winter. Maybe she'll be like a faceless man. I've heard a really dark version of this theory, which I don't subscribe to, but I think it's another theory worth mentioning, and that is that maybe Arya will murder Missandei and take her name and take her face, and so she'll be like next to Daenerys. That sort of idea. I don't know. That feels very dark. I mean, Arya's in a kind of a dark place in the Mercy chapter in the Winds of Winter, and we can imagine something like that continue, like that sort of dark theme continuing on before Arya ends up redeeming herself, because I think that Arya will redeem herself from this darkness that she's currently in. Murdering Missandei and taking her face seems really kind of grimdark to me, but I don't know. We'll see what George does with it. But I'm still a fan of of Arya returning with Justin Massey, and I do agree that how much story are you going to fit into Arya's plot or story, so to speak, with the amount of with 2 books remaining in the Song of Ice and Fire canon? I, I don't think you could do it really.
It's really difficult. And yeah, I think the fact that Martin sends Justin Massey to Bravos, potentially with, or at least having just met Jane Poole pretending to be Arya, that just strikes me as too strong a connection to be left completely unused. So I think at the very least, Arya will hear about Justin Massey and his mission and experience a shock at some other girl being called Arya Stark, and this will somehow be involved in her arc of returning home. Maybe that's what sparks her interest to go home when she actually does it via Daenerys' crusade. I could see that happening. Because, there are connections here between Arya and Dragon Skulls and such, but we always have to keep in mind, as we've said ad nauseum, that certain bits of foreshadowing and groundwork in book 1 are never going to pay off because Martin has changed the story with his gardening style since. So this is also possibly an artifact of that. But to move on to events that do pay off, last week we referred to Eddard 14 as Ned's own Red Wedding, this shocking moment of horror and downfall and bloodshed. And that really struck me on rereading this chapter, how much it feels paced out like the Red Wedding from Arya's perspective specifically. Of in A Storm of Swords, how she gets so close to her family and she's trying to save her family. She's running past them, past their men who are dying. And, she's trying to find safety, but she has to ultimately run for it. I feel like Martin really drew from this scene when he was writing Arya's chapters at the Red Wedding. Catelyn's chapters in the Red Wedding are their whole isolated, horrifying, beautiful thing that we'll get to when we get to them. But Arya's chapters, Arya 10 and 11, I think, in A Storm of Swords, just feel very much like this chapter to me.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that George exposes Arya to a lot of trauma throughout her arc. I mean, not just here, but in Harrenhal itself, where she's witnessing the tortures that are going on there. That trauma is going to have an impact on her. But yeah, this is really Red Wedding like in terms of all of the chaos unfolding and watching men die around her. And the other aspect too that's very similar to the Red Wedding is that she's never able to make it to Catelyn, to her mother. Here, she's never able to make it to Ned Stark. And in this case, though, she consciously makes the decision not to go up the tower steps to the Tower of the Hand, even though Ned's not up there at that point. He's in the throne room or he's in the dungeons then. I do think that Martin plays on this motif, and I think he does it really well, and that Arya's ever so close, but ever so far away from reaching out to her siblings, to her family, to her father, to her mother. It's heartbreaking, man. It really, really is heartbreaking. Like when you see the amount of shit that Arya's had to experience and had to play a part in as well, and it's hard. It's hard stuff. Like, I mean, she's 9. She's 9, right? 9 or 10 at this point in the story. At this juncture in the story.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's all part of the tragic downfall of House Stark, as we were talking about last week. The way it just tears at your heart, and as I said last week, makes you kind of desperately latch on to Robb as the potential savior figure when we get cut back to him in the Bran chapters. And that's why all the Stark siblings, when they're apart from Robb, are always thinking, I can be as brave as Robb, and Robb will kill you all, and I can be strong just like Robb, because Robb is the image in their head, an image in their heads of the Stark who's going to make it all correct, which is what makes it so devastating at the Red Wedding when his crusade finally fails and he can't make it all right. But as we were talking about Daenerys a little earlier, there is also an interesting potential connection here between what Syrio says of Braavos and what Dany remembers of Braavos.
Yes. Syrio Forel and his discussion of the Sea Lord's menagerie. So this is a interesting moment in a Game of Thrones, right? Where Syrio Forel is explaining some of his backstory and how he became the first Sea Lord of Braavos. And one of the things he talks about is that the Sea Lord has a menagerie in his possession where he has all sorts of these crazy animals that he brings from all over the world to his little zoo. And menagerie, for those who don't know, it is a zoo essentially. And the Sea Lord has all these creatures, these animals at the zoo. So there is a theory that I am a big fan of, and there is also the fact. So let's start with the fact first. The fact is that the house with the red door is in Braavos, and stop coming up with the bad, ugly theories, guys. Just stop. Now, the theory side, more fun. So the theory that I'm a big fan of is that the house with the red door is in Braavos, but it's in a specific place in Braavos, namely the Sea Lord's Palace. And the reason why I'm a fan of this theory is a couple reasons. One, you have the Sea Lord signing as a signatory for the pact, for the Dornish Pact, between Oberyn and Willem Darry, with the Sea Lord signing a signatory that is revealed in A Dance with Dragons Daenerys 7. And then secondly, and most importantly for this chapter, when Dany has her vision in the House of the Undying, she thinks this, and this is right after she sees Willem Darry. She fled from him, but only as far as the next door. I know this room, she thought. She remembered those great wooden beams and the carved animal faces that adorned them. Keep that line in mind. And there, outside the window, a lemon tree. The sight of it made her heart ache with longing. It is the house with the red door, the house in Braavos. So, circling back to those lines, great wooden beams and the great wooden beams. And the great wooden beams and the carved animal faces that adorn them. So to me, I think that Syrio's discussion of the Sea Lord's menagerie being a place where all the animals are kept, and Daenerys's memory via via kind of hallucination at the House of the Undying of the great wooden beams with carved animal faces means that Daenerys is seeing part of the House with the Red Door being either the Sea Lord's palace itself or a building off of the Sea Lord's palace that the Sea Lord Braavos had kept the Targaryen children at when he was safeguarding them. So I do think that's an interesting potential connection that we see between Daenerys and Braavos here that is really kind of brought well together when we get the House of the Undying vision and then flashing back to Syrio's description of the Sea Lord's menagerie. And I think it's important. It's important plot setting for eventual reveals because I think like the major one of the things that's been talked about at significant length is that George said back in 2015 that well the Sea Lord's palace and the different things about it. There's something to be revealed about that, and then he didn't really expound upon that anymore. And the reason why I think he didn't expound on that anymore is that I think that the reveal is something along the lines that the House of the Red Door was at the Sea Lord's palace, and all of that chaos that ensued afterwards with the servants stealing stuff was as a result of the Sea Lord dying and Daenerys and Viserys having to get the fuck out of Braavos quick, fast, and in a hurry. So I think that's an interesting connection. I'm not 100% on it, but I do love that theory a lot, and I hope that it's something we'll see a little bit more of in The Winds of Winter. As you know, we have Arya Stark, who's going to be running around Braavos throughout her chapters in The Winds of Winter, most likely doing all sorts of faithless men stuff, and of course, regaining her identity as Arya Stark.
Yeah, I like that theory quite a bit. As you say, it does fit with the Sea Lord being witness to the marriage pact between Arianne and Viserys, and so being involved in some level on Targaryen restoration. And because Arya is a POV there, and because we have this visual signifier of the red door, it would be the easiest thing to confirm. All you gotta do is have Arya run past some building on the Sea Lord's property and mention, "Oh, what a great red door she saw! It stood out in her." That's just the easiest thing to confirm, and have every one of us losers online go, there's the proof we need. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is the case at all, and Martin is going to drop this in passing when it comes to the Winds of Winter. I think it's a solid theory for sure. But
sorry, I got one more point.
Go for it.
One of the things that Arya talks about in A Dance with Dragons when she's giving her, or is it A Feast for Crows or A Dance with Dragons? I can't remember which one it is, but one of her chapters, she talks about that the Sea Lord is sick and that the Bravos are sharpening their blades in preparation for the next coming election or the next succession
Mm-hmm.
of power in Bravos. I can definitely see the Faceless Men taking a certain interest in who the new Sea Lord might be, and potentially dispatching a girl with no name onto the Sea Lord's palace up there to kind of to get a look in on what's going on up at the palace itself. And I like your idea of like Arya like running through and seeing, oh, there's a house with the red door, and moving on to this next thing, and like all of
Exactly.
us are gonna lose our fucking minds. So it's gonna be great. It's gonna be so great to see the wrongs proved wrong. But Emmett, I think the great thing about this chapter, and I know like we're all like getting emotional about Syrio and everything like that, but that's really because Martin is a huge trope smasher, right? He totally deceived us. He deceived everyone about the fate of Syrio Forel because Syrio is alive. He's alive, Emmett. Can you believe it? He's alive.
Note the thrill coursing across my face.
He's
I feel
so
like it's Christmas. Come
that's
again in February.
and do you know who he is?
Do tell, Jeff.
Not only is he alive, but he's Quaithe.
My favorite, the Song of Ice and Fire character, Quaithe of Ashai. What a beautiful Christmas gift this is to me, Jeff.
Quaithe. Can you believe it? He's Quaithe of the
No, I can't, in fact. So, of course, one of the more famous / infamous tinfoil theories about A Song of Ice and Fire is the notion that Syrio Forel did not actually die here. And some variations of these theories characterize Syrio as being in truth a faceless man, the very one who later interacts with Arya under the name of Jaqen H'ghar in Harrenhal. Now, to give the bads and uglies their due day in court, as Stannis would wish of us, there are some points in favor. We do not actually see Syrio die in this chapter. George R. R. Martin is fond of the fake out death. We see that with Bran at Winterfell. We see that with Davos at the Blackwater, Sandor at the end of A Storm of Swords, Arya herself at the Red Wedding. There's that moment where it says Sandor's axe took her in their head and you have no idea if she survived or not. So this is a thing Martin does.
Sure.
Meryn Trant is, as mentioned, a mediocre fighter at best.
Sure.
There is the Bravosi connection between Syrio and Jaqen, as well as some themes in common between the mantras that they give Arya.
That's true. And I mean, we also have 2 points where George was at conventions and people point blank asked him, like, is Syrio Forel alive? And he kind of sidestepped the question both times and was like, well, he's alive in the show, because he was asked one of the times during season 1. And then the other time, like, I think it's something like, someone asked him at a convention 2010, like, is Syrio Forel alive? And like the response that George apparently gave was like, he said nothing, and then moved on immediately to the next thing there. So I mean, like, so that's obviously showing that Syrio is alive. He could be Jaqen. I mean, I'm still keeping my Quaithe idea, because I think like she's so mysterious and I love her so much. And I feel like that I love Syrio and I love Quaithe, so I feel like they're the same.
Ergo, it's just like math. They just fit together. It's like putting a puzzle. So to counter that position, I think oftentimes parallels between characters are interpreted as them literally being the same person when they're actually links in the same chain in terms of the POV that we see these characters through. Like, Mance is not Rhaegar, literally, just because Mance is also a bard and has the red and black coloring, etc. He's Jon's training wheels for Rhaegar. He's setting Jon up to deal with Rhaegar as his actual dad.
Right.
Dario is not actually Euron. What he does is reveal the part of Daenerys that would be very much into Euron, that he's part of the arc. I think only when something glaring and inexplicable happens, like Sir Maynard Plum vanishing mysteriously right when Bloodraven turns up in the Mystery Night, only when something like that happens should we fall back on X character is actually Y character. And I don't think we see that here. Yeah, I think Jaqen... Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think you're right, and to put my cards on the table, I don't think that Syrio is Jaqen or Quaithe. I mean, like you say, I mean, it's very much these kind of fake out deaths that we see is intended to be. It's not intended to be like their arcs are not over yet. When Arya Stark is struck by the blunt axe head of Sandor Clegane, it doesn't like her arc is not over yet. Like Robb Stark and Catelyn's story was essentially over, though Catelyn's, of course, exists in another form, in some version, in the form of Stoneheart. But no, I totally agree with you there that these characters are not, that Dario is not Euron, Mance is not Rhaegar. Like, they have commonalities, sure, but their commonalities exist to show kind of a thematic throughput of different ideas that Martin is embedding into these POV characters, and more, and not just something like, well, actually, after all, Mance was Rhaegar Targaryen. Like, boom, like, well, okay. I mean, like that.
That requires a whole nother book to explain that.
Right.
I don't need that. I think Jaqen is meant to build on Syrio's teachings. It's all part of this connection within Arya's arc. He's meant to take the same basic ideas and twist them in strange and frightening ways. Like the Faceless Man is a considerably darker mentor than the First Sword.
Right.
Like Jaqen gets Arya into some difficult territory, and that reflects how Arya's story gets darker when she has to cross the T.S. Eliot wasteland that is the Riverlands at war. They're different steps on the same downward spiral stair, and we see Yoren and Sandor and the Brotherhood as a whole contribute to the same arc on Arya's part. There's the idea that, Meryn Trant's far too mediocre fighter to bring down Syrio, but as I've already addressed, I think that's the point. This is where Syrio's skills can't avail him, and so it becomes about his inner qualities, what he's bringing to the table in terms of his decisions. And I think if you look at the series as a whole, that kind of romantic death fits more than a sneaky escape. Like there's that line Jorah has about Rhaegar fought valiantly, Rhaegar fought honorably, Rhaegar fought nobly, and Rhaegar died. And I think that's what happened here with Syrio Forel. As you were saying, Martin is fond of the fake-out death, but it's always with a character he has bigger plans for. Davos has to live after the Blackwater to rescue Edric Storm and Stannis' soul. Bran has to live past Clash of Kings so he can reach the innermost cave and complete his hero's journey. And Sandor, Martin is keeping him alive for some purpose. As he had Thoros say, the Lord of Light is keeping Sandor alive for some reason, so we'll see what that is in the Winds of Winter and Dream of Spring. But Syrio Forel, I think the Last Stand is the point.
Right.
And I don't think I can explain this any better than a friend of the show, Stephen Atwell, did in his essay on Arya 4.
Whoop, whoop.
Quote, he gets to be the champion of right and the beauty of his craft, and to save a child from imprisonment and possible death. He gets to go down swinging against impossible odds with the chance to humiliate one of the Kingsguard. He gets to become, in the mind of one girl and any man who comes out of that room alive, a legend.
Mm-hmm.
Survival means that one day, Syrio Forel's feet will lose their nimbleness. His sword arm will forget its strength, and he will likely die of old age, alone and unremembered. And that puts me in mind of Big Bucket Wool's war monologue from A Dance with Dragons, talking about how he'd rather have his men go down swinging to save, in their minds, the same girl, Arya Stark, from the monstrous Ramsay, and how that's meaningful and that's powerful and that's something better for them than just dying starving. But on the other hand, of course, that came only 4 chapters after Alaria Sand's peace monologue, sure, talking about how we need to stop the cycle of violence, and that's equally beautiful written, and that's equally moving, albeit in the opposite direction. So I think finding the place where both of those perspectives can be true is part of the project of A Song of Ice and Fire, and thus part of the project of rereading it. And I think we have to make room for the fact that while the series generally looks at swordplay and violence and war as just horrible, nightmarish things, that Syrio Forel's Last Stand is presented really romantically. And we have to, I think, recognize that, and recognize that Syrio knew the consequences going in and faced them. I think that's what makes it powerful.
It also makes it powerful too that it was his sacrifice to save an innocence we talked about in the main cast. I mean, Syrio Forel dying when he does is so powerful, not just because it, there's badass words, there's a great sword fight. It's so powerful because he is operating in such a manner to save the life of Arya Stark, to save her from captivity, however you want to put it. The thing is that sacrifices have to matter. And it's a great point that you brought up a couple times here, in that what heroes do is not throw other people in the way of danger. What heroes do is that they throw themselves into danger. And that's what Syrio Forel did with a wooden fucking stick. And he took out 5 Lannister dudes and killed all of them, most likely, but ended up dying because Meryn Trant, as mediocre as he is as a swordsman, is armored from head to heel. And he dies having saved Arya Stark's life. So to have him pop back up as Jaqen H'ghar or Quaithe of the Shadow, whatever fucking thing you want to, identity you want to throw upon him, really cheapens the sacrifice that Syrio Forel makes and makes us go,
exactly.
Okay, that's great. I mean, when you go back and you read A Game of Thrones Arya 4, now published 23 years ago, nearly 23 years ago at this point, it would crush us. I mean, it would be crushing if we read The Winds of Winter and suddenly Jaqen H'ghar pulls his face off in, A Feast for Crows, or not a Feast for Crows, but in Old Town to Samuel Tarly, and it's like, well, actually, I am the dancing master, Syrio Forel, all along. And you're like, okay, great. Well, that means that what Syrio Forel did back in the Game of Thrones is meaningless. Syrio Forel's sacrificing of himself allows him to embed himself both in the readers' minds and also carries part of his personality along with him to the point where Arya in this chapter is hearing Syrio's voice, and that voice is just going to keep on going, and it only keeps on going because the sacrifice was made, and the sacrifice matters for Arya Stark, and it matters that Syrio Forel died, and that's all I got to say about it.
There's my single favorite line in the entire series is probably "Men's lives have meaning, not their deaths." From Quentin's chapter, The Spurned Suitor in A Dance with Dragons. And I think you can see that with Syrio here, because we don't need to see him die. We don't need to see him cut down by Meryn Trant, because we see the moment that matters. And the moment that matters is him being willing to sacrifice it all, as you said, throwing himself on the line. In the same way it matters that Davos has no guarantee of survival when he sends Edric Storm off in a boat. He embraces the smuggler self inside him and knows that that might be the death of the Lord self, because he's going up against Stannis, and Stannis is not known for forgiving people. Although he's a little more flexible in that regard than his reputation suggests, as you've written about before, but that's neither here nor there. Same thing with Brienne. She could easily have stayed in that farmhouse at the inn and let Rorge and his wrecking crew do what they want to those kids at the end, but she stepped out to throw her life on the line because she realized, if I don't do that, then it doesn't mean anything that I want to be a true knight and go around and save princesses. Yep. It's meaningless if I find Sansa Stark, but I let these kids die. It will be a hollow victory. And you can see the same thing with Syrio here, that he's like, yeah, I could run, but then who am I then? Right. What's the meaning? What was it I was believing in all those decades? What will my life be if I run away now and let them take this child? And he makes that stand. And I mean, there's a reason we're calling this, because that's what heroes do. That's what heroes do. And that's my final statement on the chapter. Gosh darn it.
Yeah, man. Fuck yeah. Fuck yeah. So I have a final question for you, sir. So if men's lives have meanings, does Syrio Forel's death have meaning then?
Well, I mean, if you're just going to ask devastating questions that touch the core of my very belief system, Jeff, I guess that's just going to be our thing now. No, but I mean, like I was saying, I think, well, Martin certainly does indulge in gore at many points in the series, and sometimes it feels like he's doing it just for the sake of doing it. I think it's a really important decision for him not to show Syrio's death here, and to have us have the moments that we remember being Syrio standing even as his stick breaks, even as death becomes inevitable. That's the crucial moment he wants to zero in on. I think that's what demonstrates the worth of that theme, that this is how Syrio lived his life, and that's where we cut, that's where we break. I think that's a crucial decision on the author's part. And, well, I think it still would have been a good chapter if we'd seen Syrio's head fly off and bounce down the pews towards Arya or whatever. I think it would be a much lesser chapter.
No, I totally agree. I was just trying to kind of jab you a little bit there towards the end of this podcast.
Well, I never.
So I think that about closes us out for this chapter. And for those of you who are still in the live cast portion, we will have a little bit of Q&A after we close out this episode itself. So thank you, everyone, for listening and for tuning in and watching us. It's touching. I mean, honestly, for me, that you guys care enough about Song of Ice and Fire, which is something that both Emmett and I love, enough to both listen to us as well as watch our stupid ugly faces as we talk about this chapter, and see, and you guys, for those who are watching, you get to see all the fuck ups that we make and that end up getting edited out in post production, which is great, right? I mean, like, you get to see how the sausage is actually made. So if you guys are interested, I know we've gotten a few questions in the chat asking about whether this episode will be available on the regular podcast feed, and yes, it will be coming out on Monday, the 11th of February. But as always, thanks for listening. Rate and review us on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, Podbean, ACAST, anywhere and everywhere you can find your podcasts.
Absolutely. You can hit us up at NotACast ASOIAF on Twitter, or shoot us an email at NotACastASOIAF@gmail.com. Personally, you can find me at Poor Quentin on Twitter, or at poorquentin.tumblr.com.
Yeah, and you can find me at Brendan Bfish on Twitter, Brendan Bfish on Reddit, and my website, as always, is warsandpoliticsofIceandfire.wordpress.com. At least I think that's what the website is called. I don't know. Sure. And I think for those of you guys who are listening in right now on this Monday or watching, I will have actually a new Wars and Politics of Ice and Fire essay coming up tomorrow on the Broken Country Part 2. Which is about marriage, lands, and alliances, all about Roose Bolton and what he does prior to the Red Wedding, and what Ramsay Snow as well does too. So I think you guys hopefully will enjoy that one too.
Perfect. I think that's going to be great to witness. I always love your essays, sir. Thanks everyone for watching and listening to our episode on A Game of Thrones Arya 4. And now I think we're going to answer a couple questions for the people who are still sticking around in the chat. If you have anything to comment on this episode or chapter, or more broadly speaking, you can bring it up in the chat now, and we'll answer a couple before we go.
I'm watching you guys now. I'm seeing all of you guys right now. I'm eye to eye.
Christopher Cully says you guys are much more handsome than I imagined in my head, which I don't know if that's a compliment or an insult. But
were we just Uggs like in people's heads? I guess.
Are our voices ugly? Is that what you're saying, Christopher?
Christopher. Oh, you want to see the dog? Dude, come here. Come here.
Can I vote to see the dog? Can we see the cat? What's wrong with you people?
Dude,
well, that's nice.
Come here. Come here.
Jeff, we can see your shorts. Never mind. That's a good thing we can see your shorts.
There you go. You want to see the legs?
I'm sure someone wants to somewhere.
Okay, so question we have in the chat. How did Jaqen, Rorg, and Biter end up in the Black Cells, and why?
That's an excellent question. We've talked before about how realistic it is that Jaqen ended up in the Black Cells, whether he was doing another job before he got there. Rorg and Biter, I'm going to go out on a limb and say they were just being Rorg and Biter, just in general. Like, whenever we get to the part about Martin talking about how fantasy doesn't need any more obvious one-note villains, I like to raise my hand and go, hey, what about Rorg and Biter? Two obvious monsters who have no depth to their personality whatsoever. I mean, Martin has said, like, Rorg put Biter, like, filed down Biter's teeth as an orphan and put him in, like, dogfighting rings. And I'm like, well, that's just pure evil in its most unadulterated form. So I'm guessing they were doing that, and maybe they just didn't bribe the right person, or just got vile enough that even the gold cloaks had to take a turn. I'm guessing they were just being themselves, and eventually it caught up.
Yeah, I can see that. So I actually pulled up the Suspect Martin where George talked about that, and it says that Rorg owned a pot shop or a bar, one of the two, in Fleet Bottom, the really bad part of King's Landing. Rorg would stage rat fights and dog fights, bear cub fights, etc., and make money off
bear cubs.
I know.
That's like the most cartoonishly evil thing you can do. What do you think, Queen Alysanne?
Is Queen Alysanne on?
I know. She's soft and pure, so Jeff will hate her.
Gosh. I love her.
Listen to the noise Jeff just made. I didn't know he could do that.
I love her.
She's so small.
She's pretty cute and pure. Yeah, so Rorg would Rorg would have a creature like this fight in his pits. What kind of man is that? Black cells for you, sir. You don't even deserve the Night's Watch.
Yes. So, but at some point, George continues on. He found Biter, a big ugly kid with no parents or something like that, and took him in. Rorg started putting this gets shittier and shittier. Rorg started putting Biter into fights, fighting mastiffs and bear cubs. So, Rorg put his buddy Biter into the ring to fight against all these animals, and then he said something like, "And all of this led to his winning personality." So there you go. That's the backstory for Biter that I haven't written yet, but I might. Well, yeah, of course they're going to end up in the goddamn Black Cells. I mean, they're fighting motherfucking like bears, and like he's putting humans against animals. And so it's just, yeah. So that's
the worst. Someone mentioned in the cast, I didn't catch the name real quick, that the real question is why Rorg and Biter seem subservient to Jaqen.
Okay.
And I recall from Arya's PV that they're just kind of frightened of him.
Yes.
And I mean, again, it's the Black Cells. Who knows what Jaqen did down in the Black Cells when he was with them? Maybe he did the whole change face thing to them and just freaked them the hell out because they'd never seen anything like that before. Yeah. And anything is possible when you're locked in a cell with a dude. So I think Jaqen did something probably pretty terrifying to them. And I think that also that's just there from the author to emphasize, Jaqen Hagar, he's a real big deal because even Rorg and Biter are afraid of him. And I think it's supposed to be left up to our imaginations. Again, a lot of the bravosy, faceless man characters feel like they're being filled in as they go more than there is the real strong foundation beneath how they ended up in the position they ended up in.
No,
it's kind of a cop-out, but, I think it's the case.
Yep. Oh, man. Those guys, I'm telling you, like, in terms of characters, they're dumb and they're violent, which is like the two worst possible combinations into one character that you can find.
That's true. It's bad to be both of those things. And they're used very well. Like, I think they're deployed perfectly as Brienne's heels at the end of A Feast for Crows.
Oh, yeah.
To provoke that no chance, no choice moment. Because in order to have that moment mean anything, the threat has to be real and has to be unambiguous and coming from people who are not going to back down. And Rorg and Biter are not going to back down. So that's how you get that moment.
Got it.
But yeah, let's acknowledge they're not exactly the complex, depthful villains that we generally associate with George R. R. Martin. It's just not the case with those two.
True that. All right, so we have another question from Broken King, which is referring to a recent Patreon episode about Aegon the Third, in which he asked, "Do you believe that Aegon the Third's move to oust Lord Manderley was a good power move and demonstration to the rest of the kingdom?" I say no, because the line at the end of Fire and Blood Volume 1 is that it ended up leading up to enmity between the Manderleys, between Lord Manderley and Aegon the Third for the rest of his realm. Like, basically, Aegon the Third walks into the small council chambers and just tells everyone to go fuck off. Like, that's really, as much as I like Aegon the Third as a character, I don't think it's a really good move on Aegon the Third's part, because it ends up alienating him from a really strong ally, and really strong ally in the form of someone in the north. So I think it's not a great move. I don't think it's a power. I mean, I think it appears to be a power move, but I think it ends up having some pretty terrible consequences for Aegon the Third and for his regime after the Regency period ends. And Aegon the Third's reign thereafter is not especially happy. Could have been more happy if Manderley was still acting as Hand of the King, maybe, I guess, but I don't know. I don't think it was. I just don't think it was a very smart political move on the part of Aegon the Third.
Completely agree with everything you said there. I love the Manderleys. Never kick the Manderleys out of power.
Right.
They're only here to help. Always give the Manderleys as much influence as possible. This is my general go-to move. We got another question from John Ice Eyes about the theory that Jaqen showed up at King's Landing because he was being hired by Littlefinger to kill Ned. I don't put a lot of stock in that, because I think the reason Littlefinger wants Ned dead is not just for the pleasure of having Ned die, but to specifically foment this conflict between the Starks and the Lannisters. That's why he does it through Joffrey. And that's why he makes this a big political event that will contribute to the War of Five Kings. If he just has some random assassin do it, everyone's going to go, okay. I guess we're just going to keep going. Unless there's this another elaborate thing where Littlefinger's going to frame someone for, which I guess could be the case. But overall, I think Littlefinger is trying to set Lannister against Stark and Tully and benefit from the chaos they're in, as well as getting his vicarious revenge on the people he feels have wronged him. And I think he is specifically delighting in using the Lannisters and Starks against each other. And I think he is not relying on third parties more powerful than, say, the Kettleblacks, whom he has complete control over, or so he believes.
Yeah, and I think some people have given credence to Littlefinger's lines in Eddard 8, where Littlefinger is talking to the small council, and Ned overhears Littlefinger saying, like, "Oh, well, we could," well, someone suggests to hire the Faceless Men, and Littlefinger says, "Do you know how much that would cost?" And that was only for a merchant. And there's been the theory that's referring to Illyrio Mopatis, and potentially.
Sure, that could be a thing.
I guess
that seems a little more likely, if not still quite likely.
Yeah, but I think, like, the thing about Littlefinger is that why would you use a Faceless Men when you have a really good plan to bring down the Starks? I mean, it's shitty and it's awful, but at the same time, like, he has all his cards on the table. Why would he bring a Faceless Man over to kill Ned Stark? Like, I think the vibe that I get from Littlefinger more than anything else is kind of similar to what Doran Martell says to the Sand Snakes and Arianne in The Dance with Dragons, that the plan for him and Tywin Lannister was that he was going to bring everything crashing down around Tywin Lannister before finally killing him. That's kind of
that's a good comparison. Yep.
Same motif I'm seeing in Littlefinger, that he wants to bring, Ned Stark and everything around Ned Stark crashing around before he finally kills Ned Stark. Although in the case of Ned, it's a little bit, as we're going to talk about here in Arya 5, most likely Littlefinger was likely the one who counseled Joffrey to kill Ned. So maybe that comparison doesn't quite work. I mean, I'm kind of like, I don't know. I'm riffing now, man. I'm riffing.
No, I agree with you. If he sends a Faceless Man assassin after Ned, he doesn't get to pull the dagger out and shove it under Ned's neck and go, "I did warn you not to trust me." Right. And Littlefinger wants that moment. That's what he's been building to. That's what gets Littlefinger hard at night, is thinking of that moment. He doesn't get to do that if he sends the Faceless Man. It's compare him to Euron. Euron doesn't seem to give a damn about personally killing Balon Greyjoy and taking over like the Seastone chair from him. Like, Euron has no emotional investment in that. He doesn't seem to have had a big relationship with Balon. He doesn't seem to have a chip on his shoulder. It's just something he has to get done in order to take over. But this is meaningful for Littlefinger. This is personal. He wants to be there. I don't think he has any go-betweens when it comes to delivering this event. He wants to be on that dais when Ned Stark gets his head cut off at the Sept of Baelor and have no one realize what's going on but him. That's what he's about.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he's very much, like I said in the summary for Eddard 14, like, he's got one dagger at Ned's neck and he's got his other dagger poking Ned in the upper thigh. If you know what I mean, right? If you know what I mean.
I have no clue what you mean, sir. frankly.
Yeah. All right. Let's see what else we got here. We got a question. Emmett, do you believe in Solon's philosophy that how a man and I'm sorry, I'm Broken King. You have a Emmett, do you believe in Solon's philosophy about how a man dies, how he matters, as he told King Croesus of Lydia?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think what Martin is suggesting there is not that there's no such thing as a beautiful or glorious death, but more that you shouldn't race to the grave or assume that the legacy you have on death is your most important thing. Like we see that with Tywin, right, where he's all consumed by his legacy and ends up just rotting to pieces after he dies. So I think Martin is more focused on the idea that you should evaluate a person based on the kindnesses they live while their lives, and trying to pull us away from maybe the more kind of Greek model of the intense legacy characters, and the characters had a huge impact. And Martin is trying to say, hey, what about people who just did good in their lives and were decent? So I don't think he's necessarily trying to tear down those ideas, more just offer kind of a different and more gentler perspective on what a hero really looks like.
No, I agree with that.
It's a legit point, though. I mean, I don't want to suggest that Martin is completely tearing down those previous tropes of the Elan and the glorious death. They're definitely in there with Syrio. I just think he's reframing them within the context of the work as a whole. And as you were saying, the important thing about Syrio being not that he dies, but why he dies.
Yeah, 100%. We got a question from Koi Vanazi, who asks, does Baelish have a big pile of gold, or is his wealth all in paper dragons? So I think I could answer that one. When we talked about Eddard IV from A Game of Thrones, we talked about Littlefinger's essential debt scheme, and that he was borrowing money essentially against the Iron Throne, and he was accruing these things. So he was accruing, it wasn't just like paper dragons that he was accruing properties, he was accruing ships, and I don't know what all the stuff that Tyrion lists, like ships, merchant houses, different things that he has on his retinue, and these things work as a form of hard currency and something that Littlefinger could take loans out against. So he takes out a loan to purchase a house, and then he uses that house as collateral to take out yet another loan and further in debts King's Landing and indebts the royal treasury. So he does actually have real gold. I mean, the thing is about Littlefinger is that he's stolen, essentially stolen Westeros. I mean, that was it's a great essay from Stephen Atwell's. It's not just Stephen Atwell. It was from Tower of the Hand, which Aziz, if you're still in the chat somewhere, you put a part in from A Hymn for Spring, where Stephen Atwell wrote a fantastic essay called Who Stole Westeros, in which he ended up concluding that it was Littlefinger, essentially, with his debt scheme, who brought Westeros into financial ruin. So he has the ability to call debts and call down debts, as well as take out loans on behalf of the Iron Throne. And this is how he has his money in order to pay off the gold collects. I mean, it's kind of like crazy if you think about it. We didn't really talk about this in Eddard 14, or Eddard 13 for that matter. But Littlefinger essentially took out the royal treasury, money from the royal treasury, or took a loan out against the Iron Throne in order to bring Ned Stark down on behalf of the Lannisters. Like, there's this kind of convoluted money scheme that's going on there. So, yeah, I don't know. It's hard. It's difficult sometimes to like conceptualize what Littlefinger is doing, but it's really fascinating to me because, I mean, like I said in Eddard 4, like I really enjoy personal finance and kind of enjoying some of the ways that Martin explores these concepts of loans and debt obligation that he brings to the fore in Westeros and kind of in a medieval-ish setting, and I think it's a lot of fun to talk about.
Absolutely. What Littlefinger is building is basically a bubble. And while Martin was certainly writing this stuff in the relatively go-go 90s, well before the financial collapse in the late aughts, he was writing it coming off the savings and loan crisis and other financial sector-ish scandals of the Reagan era. And I think he might have had this in mind with Littlefinger, where Littlefinger's power is that he can just pull one string and bring the whole house of cards down behind him whenever he pleases. And you see him working that way in Sansa's Released Winds of Winter chapter, when his plan is to store up all the food and kind of beggar people into paying exorbitant prices for them, which is a risk, because what if your entire customer base starves while they're waiting for you to deliver them food? That's how Littlefinger operates. And I think the other form of currency he has, as Tyrion notes in Clash of Kings, is that all the people in the financial sector are his. So if push comes to shove, he can get them to steal or fabricate or do whatever he needs to provide him with either the liquid capital or, as you say, collateral to support any number of financial dealings down the road. So yeah, I don't think if Tyrion marched into Littlefinger's solar the first day he arrived in King's Landing, or Ned did with the Gold Cloaks and demanded to see Littlefinger's books, I think Littlefinger is screwed. I don't think he has anywhere near the liquid capital to back up all the crazy debts and expenditures he's been doing on Robert's account. But I think he knows well enough that he's untouchable, and it's confusing enough for that not to happen.
Agree there. All right. So I think, Emmett, if you're good, we'll take 2 more questions and we'll probably close around 10:30. Is that good with you?
Sure, that sounds good for me, sir.
All right. So we have someone who asked if Varys' 3 children stacked on top of each other wearing a cloak.
Yep, favorite tinfoil theory right there. That's just the dream.
It's good for me. Travis M., one of our small council members, who is the Master of Ships, Lord Warden of the Waves, asks, with the staple boy, Arya forgets everything Syrio taught her and instead remembers Jon's stick 'em with the pointy end. What would Syrio teach her to do in that situation that's different than Jon?
That's a good question. I guess maybe just threaten the kid first, like she does with Hot Pie.
Right.
Like hold out the sword and get away, or I'm going to stick you, and then run for it. But even then, the stable boy might immediately run and tell Cersei, so that could have gotten her killed. So that's a good question. I don't know whether we're supposed to think, oh, Syrio would have had an answer if only she'd remembered, or maybe we're supposed to think maybe this is a situation in which Syrio doesn't have an answer. Maybe no matter how calm and still and in control you are, there's no good way out of this other than killing the kid. Yeah. So I think I could argue that one either way.
I think I see the same sort of thing in that I could potentially see that's the thing, right? So the context of it to me reads like that she's witnessing she's remembering what she just saw with Syrio dealing with the Lannisters there. But
yeah, good point.
It's not the same situation. I mean, the kid's carrying a pitchfork. It's not like 5 Lannister guardsmen with carrying broadswords or long swords. And
yeah, the kid is more the Syrio to her Meryn Trant in terms of the relative abilities and resources that are being called upon there. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. Yep. So we got another question. Which current character best parallels Rakhali Rendoon? Well, I'm going to tell you guys, if you are not patrons yet, all you got to do is send for $5 above a month, and you can listen to us talk about who we think Rakhali Rendoon from Fire and Blood Volume 1 is in the main series. It's Quaithe, obviously.
It all comes back to Quaithe, guys. We're going to have so much fun when we get to Dany's chapters in Qarth and A Clash of Kings, and I have to pretend to care. It's going to be real difficult, but you'll see me do some of my best acting work there. I swear.
It's going to be so much fun. I'm going to make you do. I'm going to make you do the synopsis for. Is that Dany 2 from A Clash of Kings for Quaithe?
Okay, I can do it right now. Nothing happens. I'm done. I did it.
Hell yeah, that'll be lots of fun. All right, let me look for one final question here. Scrolling up. We got a question from Joe the Magician, who asks, at NotACast podcast, how does Arya running away compare with Sansa writing the letter for Cersei to Robb for you? Okay, so I'm going to spoil a little bit of what I'm going to talk about next week because I was thinking about this. What I think is really fascinating is that Sansa gets, and here's me being super fair again. Emma, do you hear me? I'm being super fair.
I'm pretending to listen.
Sansa gets a lot of shit for the very last line of her next chapter being essentially like, and then it was only then she realized that she didn't even think about her sister Arya and that they had never told her anything. People were like, oh my gosh, Sansa's such a monster for not thinking about Arya there. Well, does Arya think about Sansa in this chapter? Does she? I don't know.
It's almost like this is a stressful, violent situation in which they're being like pushed to the edge. And maybe we shouldn't be coming down with our bony fingers wagging to judge them in this moment of all moments. But I don't know. I'm just a man on the internet. What do I know about things?
I don't know anything. I know nothing. And I'm also illiterate too, so I can't read too. But the question itself was, how does the Arya running away compare with Sansa writing the letter for Cersei to Robb? I mean, for me, like the comparison is that Sansa is, I mean, when the actual coup happens in King's Landing, she is up in her room and she is kept there. Arya has the advantage of being of training with Syrio Forel, so she's able to make the escape. And Sansa is put into an impossible situation, right? I mean, like we will talk about this in that it's impossible in several ways. The one of which being that she thinks that she's potentially endangering her father's life. The other being that she really has no chance or no choice, really, in that matter, besides to write the letter using the Queen's words. So, I mean. I'm so fair to Sansa. I just got to stop being fair to Sansa. I mean, that's just the thing.
You're really proud of yourself. A little more than I think you should be, buddy.
A little more than I deserve, really, for being honest.
That's okay. You can have this. I'll give it to you. We have a lot of Sansa chapters to go in this series, so whatever you need to tell yourself, Jeff, to make your way through it, you do that.
I'll tell myself, yeah, I will definitely do that.
Good.
So I think that's going to wrap us up for this Q&A portion. I hope you guys enjoyed this. We wanted to thank all you guys who are still listening and watching us.
Yes.
I mean, it's really cool that you guys are again interested in the series, but it's also cool for us too, because the reason why we're doing this live cast is that we had this. I mean, I honestly thought it was crazy and insane back in the day that, you know, we would ever get to like anywhere on Patreon, really, but we were able to get to $3,000 a month. And the fact that we were able to do that allows us to do these quarterly live casts. And I think we have a stretch goal, if I'm not mistaken. I have to take a look on Patreon, but I believe our next stretch goal is if we get to $5,000 a month, we'll be getting monthly episodes. So if you like looking at our sad, ugly faces and enjoying interacting with us in the chat, it was a lot of fun to do it. And we hope that we can definitely do that for you guys. But next quarter, I think, is going to be springtime. I'm not sure what chapter we're going to do yet. Well, actually,
I have some ideas, but y'all don't get to hear about them yet.
Oh, we'll have to go off air for that.
We'll have to keep those secrets within the household for now. But I think you'll enjoy what we got in mind.
Cool, guys. Yeah, I'm definitely going to enjoy that. As soon as I click the getting off air button, it's going to be.
All right.
I'm going to talk to you.
Oh, we're going to forget to silence this, and we're going to accidentally reveal this to everyone listening. That's the most 100% us thing that could possibly happen right now. I guarantee it. Anyway.
True. So thank you guys for listening so much. We'll see you guys, well, probably in 2 weeks now if you guys are watching this live. But if you're listening to this, we'll see you guys in a week for Game of Thrones Sansa 5. So thanks everyone for listening.
Sansa 4, not to correct my dear co-host, but yes,
Sansa 4.
So close, buddy.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
We will see the dad's downfall from the POV of the other Stark sister in Sansa 4. So thank you. As Jeff said, thank you so much for listening and watching. We really hope you enjoyed it, and we will be repeating this experiment every quarter going forward for the rest of our natural lives. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Take care.